Chapter 21. Sebastian's Aunt Henrietta, the Dowager Duchess of Claiborne, lived in an enormous pile on Park Street. Technically, the house belonged to her eldest son, the current Duke of Claiborne, although the current Duke, who took after his father, was no match for the former Lady Henrietta St. Cyr. He'd long ago retired with his wife and growing young family to a smaller house on Half Moon Street, and left his mother to reign supreme in the house she'd first entered as a bride some 54 years before. But the Dowager Duchess of Claiborne was not at her Park Street residence. Trailing his aunt through silk warehouses and Pall Mall haberdasheries, Sebastian finally ran it aground at the shop of a fashionable milliner on Bond Street. He was aware of speculative eyes following him as he wound his way toward her, through clusters of exquisitely gowned ladies, peering at their reflections, past glass-topped counters, and rows of gleaming mahogany drawers that reached to the ceiling. "Good heavens, Devlin," she said, groping for the quizzing glass she wore on a riband around her neck. "Whatever are you doing here?" "Searching for you." He eyed the puce and flamingo-pink plumed turban she held in her hands. "You're not seriously considering that, are you?" Henrietta had never been a tall woman, but she had the same stout build and large head as Hendon, with the piercingly blue St. Cyr eyes so conspicuously lacking in Sebastian. She fixed those eyes upon him now and slammed the turban on her head. "Yes, you unnatural child, I am. Now, tell me what you want, and go away." He gave a soft laugh. "Dear Aunt Henrietta, I want to know what you can tell me about Rachel Fairchild." Henrietta's plump cheeks sagged. "Lord Fairchild's middle daughter? Whatever is your interest in her? Nothing against the girl, mind you, but I don't like the stable." Sebastian raised one eyebrow. "Tell me about the stable." Henrietta studied her reflection in the mirror, her lips curving downward. The effect of the flamingo pink was not a happy one. "Basil Fairchild," she said in accents of strong distaste. "I don't recall hearing anything to his discredit." "Probably not. If I remember correctly, you were off at war trying to get yourself killed at the time. His first wife died 7 or 8 years ago, and he remarried just 2 years later to a young chit barely out of the schoolroom. Fairchild himself was in his 40s at the time. Most unseemly." "I knew Cedric Fairchild in the army. Are there other sons?" Henrietta removed the offending turban and reached for one done up in puce and navy blue silk. "No, this new marriage has been childless. But there is an elder daughter, Georgina. She married Sir Anthony Sewell. It was the year Pitt died, if I remember correctly. I understand there's a younger girl as well, but she's still in the schoolroom." Sebastian stared out of the shop window at a red and green brewer's dray lumbering up the street. A brother in the army, one older sister, one younger. It fit only too well. He said, "Rachel came out last year." "That's right." Henrietta settled the puce and navy confection on her iron-grey curls. "But let me tell you right now, Sebastian, that if you've developed a tendre in that direction—" "I've never met the girl." Sebastian studied his aunt's latest venture. "The Navy is definitely an improvement," he said. Then added, "What does she look like? Rachel, I mean." Henrietta stared at her reflection in the counter's round glass, her chin sinking back against her chest in a way that emphasized her heavy jowls. "Her mother was Lady Charlotte, one of the Duke of Hereford's daughters. Rachel takes after her. She's pretty enough, I suppose. I myself have never cared much for that rather nondescript shade of brown hair. But she has good skin and teeth, and her green eyes are lovely. Still, she never exactly took, if you know what I mean. She always simply faded into the background. It was as if she were going through the motions of her come-out, because it was what was required of her, rather than because it was something she wanted to do. Henrietta looked over at him. "If you've never even met the girl, then what is your interest in her?" Sebastian simply ignored the question. "You say she didn't take?" "Well, she was certainly far from being all the rage, but she did manage to contract a respectable alliance. Tristan Ramsay, if I remember correctly. No title, of course, but the Ramsays are quite warm." "They married?" said Sebastian in surprise. "The engagement was announced. Then the child supposedly took ill and retired to the country." "Supposedly?" "That's right. Rumour has it she's not there." "Were there other suitors?" His aunt thought a moment, then shook her head. "Not that I recall." "What do you know of Tristan Ramsay?" The Duchess fixed Sebastian with a dark glare. "He's steady and boring. Quite appallingly so, actually, considering he's only 24 or 25. He has a younger sister, Elizabeth, or something like that. She's making her come out this season, and he's being quite the dutiful son and brother, squiring his mother and sister all over town. He came into his inheritance as a child, you know. Sometimes that has disastrous effects on the development of a young man's character, but not Ramsay's. He keeps his estates in order, he doesn't gamble to excess, and if he keeps a mistress he must be very discreet about it, because I've never heard tell of it. In many ways he reminds me of Lord Fairchild." "Yet, despite this list of virtues, you don't care for either one. Why?" "If I liked steady, virtuous, boring men, I'd have lost patience with you years ago now, wouldn't I?" She removed the puce and navy silk confection, and nodded to the demure shop assistant hovering nearby. "I'll take this one." To Sebastian, Henrietta said, "Now, not another word until you explain your interest in the child." "I'll explain later," said Sebastian, leaning forward to kiss her cheek. "Thank you, Aunt." Henrietta reached out to snag his arm. "Oh, no, you don't. You can carry my package to the carriage." Sebastian glanced at the Duchess's liveried footman waiting patiently beside the shop door, then silently scooped up her purchase and followed her out of the milliner's into the fitful May sunshine. Once on the footpath, she fixed him with a critical eye that made him suddenly uncomfortable. "I've been hearing disturbing reports about your activities these past months, Sebastian. Most disturbing reports. And from what I can see, they're all true. You look like the very devil." "Why, thank you, Aunt." "Don't get me wrong. I can understand drowning your sorrows in a few bottles of brandy and wild nights on the town. It was a shock, obviously. A shock to us all. But 8 months, Sebastian. Don't you think that's a trifle excessive?" "Obviously not." She grunted. "At any rate, that's not what I wish to speak to you about. I'm worried about Hendon." "Aunt." "No, hear me out. I said I understand it was a shock, learning of the connection between Hendon and Miss Boleyn. But to allow the consequences of something that occurred more than 20 years ago to poison your relationship with Hendon now is worse than illogical. It's mean-spirited, and that's something I've never known you to be." "You think I should be able to accept with equanimity the discovery that my father is also the father of the woman I plan to marry?" "Equanimity, no. Understanding and forbearance, yes." She tightened her hold on his arm, her fingers digging into his flesh through the fine cloth of his coat and shirt sleeve. "This estrangement grieves him, Sebastian, more than you'll ever know. Nothing means more to him than you." They had reached the carriage. The footman let down the steps and stood waiting woodenly. Sebastian passed him the package, then took his aunt's hand to help her negotiate the passage through the narrow door. "Good day, Aunt," he said, stepping back. Swinging away, he had taken 2 strides towards his own waiting curricle when her voice stopped him. "By the way, Sebastian," she called maliciously through the carriage's open window, "I hear you were driving Miss Jarvis in Hyde Park yesterday." He whirled back around. "Good God! Wherever did you hear that?" But his aunt simply smiled and nodded to her coachman to drive on. Chapter 22. Lord Fairchild's residence in Curzon Street was impressively large and stylishly decorated by its new young mistress, with striped silk drapes and rich oriental carpets and Egyptian-inspired settees. As Sebastian followed the solemn-faced butler across a polished marble entry, he knew a moment of misgiving. Silver gleamed, the wood of the balustrade and hall tables glowed with wax. How could the granddaughter of a duke, born to such a genteel, rarefied atmosphere, possibly have fallen so low as to grace the tawdry parlour of a brothel like the Orchard Street Academy? Still solid and straight-backed despite his 50-something years, Basil, Lord Fairchild, had the silver-laced dark hair and sallow skin more typically seen in a Spaniard or a Frenchman from the Côte d'Azur. Receiving the Viscount in a red velvet-draped library, he fixed Sebastian with a heavy scowl and said, "If Hendon sent you here to talk to me about these damnable orders in council, you're wasting your time." The orders in council were part of Britain's tit-for-tat economic war with Napoleon, but one of the system's unintended consequences had been a heating up of tensions with the Americans. Lord Fairchild was one of those pushing for the order's repeal, whereas Sebastian's father was a strong supporter of the Prime Minister's determination to stand tough against the Americans' belligerence. "It's not that I'm soft on the defence of Canada or British shipping interests," Fairchild was saying, "but Britain needs to stay focused on defeating the French." "I'm not my father's envoy," said Sebastian, and left it at that. Lord Fairchild looked surprised for a moment, then gave a gruff laugh. "Well then, have a seat, Lord Devlin. My son Cedric has told me much of your exploits on the continent. If we had a few more men like you, maybe Boney'd be on his way to hell by now, rather than riding roughshod over all of Europe." As far as Sebastian was concerned, his activities in the army were something to be atoned for, and hopefully someday forgotten, not glorified. But he merely inclined his head and said, "Thank you, I'd rather stand." "But you will take a drink," said Fairchild with a smile. There was nothing in either the man's manner or his demeanour to suggest the grieving father. Sebastian said, "I'm afraid I may have some unfortunate news for you." "News?" Lord Fairchild's smile faded. "What news?" "It's about your daughter, Rachel." Lord Fairchild went to splash brandy into 2 glasses, his movements controlled, methodical. After a moment he said, "Rachel? Unfortunate news? I don't know what you can mean. My daughter is in the country." Turning, he held out one of the brandies, and in that moment Sebastian knew unequivocally that the man was lying. Rather than taking the glass, Sebastian reached into his pocket and drew out the delicate silver bracelet. It landed with a soft clatter on the polished surface of the table between them. "I think not." Lord Fairchild stared at the bracelet. Carefully setting aside the brandies, he stretched out a hand that was not quite steady to pick it up. He studied the medallion's crest, then raised his gaze to Sebastian's face. "Where did you get this?" 2 days ago, the young woman who owned that bracelet was murdered. She had brown hair and green eyes, and said her name had once been Rachel, although she'd lately taken to calling herself Rose. "I told you," said Lord Fairchild, setting the bracelet down again. "My daughter is in Northamptonshire." "When did you last see her?"
Why, Easter, I suppose.
The man stared back at Sebastian as if daring him to contradict it.
Yes, that was it. Easter.
I don't think so, said Sebastian. I think she's missing. I think she's been missing for some time. Now she's dead, and in a few hours she'll be given a pauper's funeral by the Society of Friends. Is that what you want? For your daughter to be buried in an unmarked grave? Lord Fairchild's cheeks darkened with rage, his eyes narrowing down to 2 small slits.
"Get out,"
he said through tight, twisted lips.
"Get out of my house."
Lord Fairchild thrust out his hand, reaching again for the bracelet. Sebastian got there first, his fist closing over the delicate silver chain and the medallion with its damning crest. "It's not your daughter's, remember," he said. For a moment the 2 men's eyes clashed, Lord Fairchild's full of fury and fear, Sebastian's sending a steady promise of intent. Then Sebastian turned on his heel and strode from the house. Sending Tom and the curricle ahead of him, Sebastian walked the footpaths of Mayfair, a deep disquiet blooming within him. Why? He kept wondering. Why would a young, gently bred woman raised in the comfort and splendour of Curzon Street run from her family's protection to seek a bleak refuge on the streets? What had she seen, heard, learned? What did she fear? He was turning his steps towards St. James's when a gentleman's carriage swung around the corner and pulled in close to the curb, the coachman dropping the horses to a walk. Sebastian glanced at the well-known crest on the panel and didn't alter his stride. The King's cousin, Charles, Lord Jarvis, let down the near window and said, "Ride with me away, Devlin." Sebastian turned to face him. "If you're planning to do away with me, I'd like to point out that there are rather a lot of witnesses about." Jarvis said dryly, "You of all people ought to know I never do my own dirty work." Sebastian laughed and leapt up into the carriage without waiting for the steps to be let down. Jarvis signalled to the coachman to drive on. "It's been brought to my attention that you've been asking questions about Monday night's fire." There was a pause. When Sebastian made no attempt to fill the silence, Jarvis shifted his considerable weight and said, "What precisely is your interest in the matter?" Sebastian studied the Baron's impassive features. "I don't like murder, especially when no one wants to acknowledge that it has taken place." Jarvis drew a delicately enamelled snuff-box from his pocket. "People are murdered in London all the time." "So I've been told." Jarvis flipped open the snuff-box and lifted a pinch to one nostril. They were playing a game, a delicate verbal dance in which Jarvis was attempting to discover if his daughter's presence at the murder scene was known without, in the process, betraying it. "There's a reason you've interested yourself in these murders," said Jarvis. "Do you have a connection with someone who was there?" "I didn't know any of the victims," said Sebastian, choosing his words with equal care. Jarvis snapped his snuff-box closed. "A witness, perhaps?" "Sir William says there were no witnesses. But then, Sir William says there was no crime." "And have you discovered anything of interest?" asked Jarvis, dusting his fingers. "Not yet." Sebastian paused, then asked maliciously, "And what is your interest in this, my lord?" A slow smile spread across the big man's face. "I take an interest in the welfare of all the king's subjects." The 2 men's eyes met and clashed, the air charged with the memory of all that had passed between them. "Of course," said Sebastian, and signalled the coachman to pull up. Sebastian was striding away when Jarvis called after him, "I saw Miss Boleyn at Covent Garden Theatre last Saturday. She's as lovely as ever. But then, she's not Miss Boleyn anymore, is she?" Sebastian stiffened a moment, but kept walking. Dropping into Gentleman Jackson's salon, Sebastian glanced around, passed a few minutes chatting with acquaintances, then left again. He was looking for Tristan Ramsay, the man who was to have wed Rachel Fairchild before she disappeared forever into the suppurating world of the city's streets. Sebastian had no doubt that Lord Fairchild would deny his daughter's disappearance to the grave. Her betrothed might be more forthcoming. Tristan Ramsay proved elusive, but in the blue room of the Cocoa Tree Club, Sebastian ran across Rachel's brother. A sporting young buck in doe-skin breeches and top boots, Cedric Fairchild sat sprawled beside another man in one of the bell chairs clustered around the room's empty hearth, one leg thrown carelessly over the chair's arm, a glass of brandy cradled in his right hand. The man beside him was unfamiliar, although he wore the yellow-frogged blue tunic of a captain in the 20th Hussars. Sebastian's acquaintance with the younger Fairchild was slight. They had served together briefly in Lisbon, but Sebastian had been a captain at the time, while Cedric had been a cornet, some 4 or 5 years his junior. Sebastian remembered him as a likeable young officer, open-faced and guileless, and quick to laugh. "Devlin," said the younger man, his legs sliding off the chair's arm when Sebastian walked up to him. "Good God, I haven't seen you in an age." "When did you sell out?" asked Sebastian. Cedric Fairchild had his father's almost black hair, with his sister's fair skin and green eyes. "Just after Alwera." He motioned to the hussar captain at his side. "You know Patrick Somerville?" "No," said Sebastian, shaking the man's hand, "but I've heard of you. You're General Somerville's son, aren't you?" "That's right," said the captain. He was tall and gaunt, with swooping blonde side whiskers and the shiny, pale skin suggestive of both malaria and a too frequent recourse to the relief to be found in quinine and arsenic. "You know my father?" "I served with him as a young lieutenant." Sebastian settled into a nearby chair. "I hear he's retired now." "Nominally." A smile crinkled the skin beside the hussar's pale blue eyes. "He spends his days preparing for a possible French invasion by marching every able-bodied cottager of Northamptonshire back and forth with pitchforks and shovels." "Only the able-bodied ones?" Somerville laughed. "Well, the ones with 2 legs, at any rate." Cedric leaned forward. "I say, Devlin, did you ever serve with Max Ludlow?" "I don't believe so. Why?" "Somerville here has just been telling me he's gone missing." Sebastian turned toward the captain. "Since when?" "Last Wednesday night," said Somerville, draining his porter. "Wednesday?" Sebastian knew a quickening of interest. "Precisely what do you mean when you say he's gone missing?" "We thought at first he must be with some wench. But 6 days and 6 nights?" Somerville shook his head. "Ludlow doesn't have that kind of stamina. Or interest, for that matter." Sebastian studied the hussar's troubled, sweat-sheened face. "Is Ludlow from Northamptonshire as well?" "Ludlow? No, Devonshire. We sent word to his brother's country seat, but they haven't seen him in months." Somerville lifted his empty glass and stretched to his feet. "I need a refill." Nodding to Sebastian, he told Cedric, "Let me know if you hear anything." Sebastian waited until the sandy-haired captain was out of earshot, then said bluntly, "I just had a conversation with your father. About your sister, Rachel." Cedric Fairchild stiffened, his pleasant smile fading away. "What about my sister?" 2 nights ago, a woman answering your sister's description was murdered in Covent Garden. I'm told this bracelet was hers." Sebastian drew the silver bracelet from his inner pocket and held it out in his palm. Cedric made no move to touch it. "Oh, God," he whispered, his face going slack. "Your father insists she's in Northamptonshire, but it's not true, is it?" Sebastian expected the man to deny it. Cedric sat for a moment, his gaze fixed on the crested medallion. Then he covered his face with his hands and drew a ragged breath. "When did she run away?" Sebastian asked. Cedric drew in another deep breath. "Last summer," he said, his voice muffled. "She never went to Northamptonshire?" "No, I don't know. She was already gone by the time I got back from Spain." "Do you know why she left?" Cedric shook his head, his splayed fingertips digging into his forehead. "Father said she quarrelled with Ramsay." "Her betrothed?" Cedric scrubbed his hands down his face, drawing them together before his mouth. "That's right." "But you don't think so?" "I don't know." He looked up, a desperate hope kindling his features. "Are you quite certain this dead woman— I mean, it might not be Rachel. Someone could have stolen her bracelet, right?" "The woman was described as young and pretty, with green eyes and brown hair. Tall, slender." Cedric collapsed back in silence. It was as if he was slowly drawing into himself, trying to absorb the unbelievable. After a moment he said, "What happened?" "She was at the Magdalene house when it burned." "Rachel!" He threw a quick glance around and leaned in closer to lower his voice. "At the Magdalene house?" Anger flared, brittle and blustering. "What the devil are you suggesting? That my sister was a— "I'm saying that a woman who fit your sister's description died in that fire." Doubt and determination hardened Cedric's face. "I want to see her body." "You won't be able to recognize her. Most of the women were badly burned." "I don't care. I want to see her." Sebastian hesitated, but after 4 years of war there would be little in the way of horrors Cedric Fairchild hadn't seen. He said, "The Society of Friends is planning to bury the women this evening. If we hurry, we should make it." Chapter 23. The Friends' meeting house in Pentonville stood at the corner of Collier Street and Horseshoe Lane, just beyond where the last straggling houses of the village gave way to fields of green-growing barley and small garden plots. Roofed in thatch, it was a simple structure of coursed stone, with a small cemetery stretching out beyond it. Sebastian drew up his curricle in the lee of a spreading elm tree and turned to the silent man beside him. "I can wait here, if you like." A cold wind blew over them, bringing with it the earthy scents of the surrounding fields and the song of a robin from somewhere in the distance. Cedric Fairchild sat with his shoulders hunched, his eyes narrowing, as he stared at the small knot of drab-gowned women and plainly dressed men in collarless coats and broad-brimmed black hats gathered on the flagged walkway leading to the meeting-house's simple stoop. "No. Please, come in." "Walk-em," said Sebastian, handing the reins to Tom. As he jumped down, one of the men near the meeting-house door detached himself from the small group and came toward them, his body tall and gaunt. "Sebastian Sincere," said Joshua Walden, "it is good of thee to come." The Quaker nodded to Fairchild. "And thee, friend, welcome." "This is Cedric Fairchild," said Sebastian. "It's possible one of the women killed at the Magdalene house was his sister. He would like to see her body." Sebastian paused, then added, "It's the woman who was shot." Cedric cast Sebastian a look of surprise, while Joshua Walden's smile faltered. "That body is badly burned, very badly burned." "I'd still like to see her," said Cedric, his jaw rigid. Walden studied the younger man's tightly held face, then nodded. "Very well. Come this way." He led them through the meeting-house's simple door into a large plain room filled with benches and the softly glowing light of evening. The room smelled of freshly planed wood, underlain faintly by the sweet stench of decay. 8 crude wooden coffins stood in a row in the centre of the meeting hall. "The woman thou seeks is the second from the end on the left," said Walden, pausing respectfully just inside the door.
The lids have not yet been nailed down."
Cedric hesitated. When he finally walked forward, it was with the measured tread of a man who dreads what he is forcing himself to do. At the side of the coffin he hesitated again, and Sebastian thought for a moment his courage had failed him. Then he grasped the edge of the plain wooden lid with both hands and thrust it up. From where he stood beside the Quaker, Sebastian watched Cedric's face blanch. He watched the man's hands tighten around the edge of the lid, saw the quiver of revulsion and horror that swept across his face. Then Fairchild dropped the coffin's lid back in place and bolted for the door. Sebastian caught up with him just beyond the stoop. He stood hunched over, his hands on his knees, his body heaving with each successive shudder of dry retching. "Here," said Sebastian, holding out his handkerchief. Cedric straightened, his fist closing convulsively around the handkerchief. A cold sweat beaded the pallid flesh of his forehead and upper lip, and he dabbed at it.
"You were right,"
he said, his breath coming in strained gasps.
"She was beyond recognizing. But I had to."
He broke off.
"I understand."
Sebastian studied the shaken man beside him.
"You knew Rachel was in Covent Garden, didn't you?"
Hot colour flooded his pale face.
"Good God! Of course not. How can you even suggest such a thing?"
The denial rang untrue, but Sebastian let it slide. He said,
"Tell me about your sister. What was she like?"
Cedric stared up the lane to where a milkmaid in a white apron and a large-brimmed bonnet was hazing a cow toward home. The evening breeze ruffled his dark hair, and his features softened with memory.
"When she was a child, she was the sweetest little creature imaginable, always bubbling with laughter and joy, yet so tender and loving. Whenever something happened, if Georgina or I were upset about something, Rachel would always come and put her arms around us and sing us a song."
A deep breath shuddered his chest.
"She used to love to sing. She'd sing to her dolls, to our father's hounds, to the stable cats."
Sebastian tried to reconcile the laughing, loving child of Cedric's memory with the cynical Cyprian hero Jarvis had described. The two images refused to blend.
"You said she used to love to sing. That changed?"
Cedric nodded.
"Around the time our mother died. It was as if, I don't know, as if all the joy within her just leached away. She quit singing, and then she—"
He broke off.
"And then what?"
prodded Sebastian. Cedric looked down at the handkerchief he held crumpled in his fist.
"I found her one day digging a row of graves in a meadow in the park. She'd borrowed a shovel from one of the gardeners. The graves were for her dolls. She said they were all dead. Then she buried them." "How old was she?"
10, 11. Sebastian's mother had died the summer he was 11, or rather, he'd been told she'd died. He stared off across the fields, lit now by the soft golden light of evening. The breeze brought them the scent of ripening grain, and the bawling of a goat tethered somewhere out of sight.
"Did she write to you when you were in the army?"
"Sometimes."
"Did she write about Tristan Ramsay?"
"She told me of the betrothal. I honestly thought she was pleased with it. She sounded happy."
"She didn't normally sound happy?"
Cedric's eyes narrowed. Instead of answering, he said,
"Why have you involved yourself in this?"
Sebastian chose his words carefully.
"There was a woman at the Magdalene house who survived the attack. She asked for my help."
From somewhere down the lane came the sweet tolling of a church bell. Cedric brought up a hand to rub his temples.
"I don't understand. What's this about an attack? About Rachel being shot? I thought the Magdalene house was simply destroyed by fire." "The fire was deliberately set to cover up the women's murders."
Cedric's hand dropped.
"I've heard nothing of this. You won't?
Sebastian turned as Joshua Walden walked up behind them, his hands folded in front of him, and cleared his throat.
We are about to begin. You are welcome to attend.
Cedric pressed the handkerchief to his lips.
I've never attended a Quaker service before. We believe that true religion is a personal encounter with God, rather than a matter of ritual and ceremony, and that all aspects of life are sacramental. Therefore, no one day or place or activity is any more spiritual than any other. But we gather together at such times to discover in stillness a deeper sense of God's presence.
Cedric lifted his gaze to the small cemetery that stretched away from the road, a plain grassed area surrounded by trees and shrubs and enclosed by a mortared low rubble wall.
You will bury her there, he said hoarsely, despite what she'd become.
There is a spark of God in every human being, said Walden, following his gaze,
and all ground is God's ground.
He put out a hand to grip the younger man's shoulder.
Come, thy sister is at peace. Let us bid her farewell.
Chapter 24. That night, Sebastian dressed in black velvet knee-breeches and black pumps with silver buckles, and set forth for Almac's assembly rooms. Known as the seventh heaven of the fashionable world, Almac's was a private club that provided its male and female members with a dance and supper every Wednesday night for the 12 weeks of the season. But unlike the men's clubs of St. James's, Almac's was a club controlled by women. The mere possession of vulgar wealth was not enough to enable one to penetrate these carefully guarded portals. The patronesses of Almac's were very careful to exclude rich cits, crass country nobodies, and even titled gently bred ladies whose indiscretions had carried them beyond the pale. For above all else, Almac's served as a safe haven where society's marriageable young women could be introduced to society's marriageable young men, which was why Sebastian had no doubt that Tristan Ramsay, whose young sister was making her debut that season, would be in attendance. Arriving at the long Palladian-styled building on King Street well before the fatal hour of 11 o'clock, after which time absolutely no one was allowed admittance, Sebastian paused just inside the club's ballroom. Adorned with gilt columns and pilasters, the room was lit by scores and scores of candles, clustered in multi-tiered chandeliers suspended overhead. The club was crowded, for the season was now at its height, and Almac's was as popular with the wives of aging parliamentarians and select foreign ministers as with the younger set. The air was heavy with the scent of hot candles, French perfume, and well-dressed, perspiring bodies. He was standing beneath the semicircular balcony for the musicians, and watching the progress of Tristan Ramsay down a line of the country dance, when a woman's voice behind him said coldly, "Whatever are you doing here?" Sebastian swung around to find his sister Amanda studying him through narrowed blue eyes. She wore an elegant gown of silver-grey satin, simply adorned with puffed sleeves, for she was still less than 18 months widowed.
"Did you hope the patronesses had blackballed me?" he said.
Amanda let out her breath in a scornful huff.
"Don't be ridiculous. You're the heir to an earldom. You could murder 6 virgins in the middle of Bond Street and they'd still let you in."
Sebastian returned his gaze to Tristan Ramsay. A small but well-formed man in his mid-20s, he had curly auburn hair and pleasant, even features, but he moved with distracted clumsiness, his face as haggard and pale as a man with the ague, or a man who'd just learned that the woman he'd once planned to make his wife was dead. He partnered a dainty young thing, with the exact same auburn hair and a scattering of freckles across her small upturned nose. This, obviously, was the young Miss Ramsay making her debut.
"We got on far more comfortably when you were still on the continent," said Amanda.
"Not to mention the exciting possibility that I might at any moment get myself killed." Sebastian let his gaze wander over the other dancers until he spied his 18-year-old niece, Miss Stephanie Wilcox, going down the line with Lord Ivans, the rakish young heir to a marquis. "Would it make you feel better if I pledged to endeavour not to irretrievably disgrace the family before my niece goes off?" He watched as Stephanie executed a neat pirouette. She had grown into a ravishing young woman with a tumble of golden curls and the vivid blue sincere eyes. Along with her mother's colouring, she had Amanda's tall, slim elegance. But unlike Amanda, Stephanie had escaped the rather blunt features Amanda had inherited from Hendon. In fact, Stephanie looked startlingly like Sebastian's own mother, Sophia. "How is Stephanie doing on the marriage mart, by the way?" he asked. "Any bidders yet?" Amanda also watched her daughter. "Don't be vulgar." "I wouldn't go with Ivans if I were you. He's rather too fond of Pharaoh." "We have hopes for Smallbone." "Has he come up to scratch yet?" Sebastian watched his niece throw a provocative, laughing gaze up at the admiring Lord Ivans. Stephanie not only looked like the errant countess, Sebastian realized, but she acted like her as well. "Not yet." "Best hope he does so soon," said Sebastian. "My niece looks dangerously fond of Ivans." The dance was ending. Sebastian watched Tristan Ramsay lead his glowing sister back to a matronly woman in puce, then disappeared toward the supper-room. "Excuse me," said Sebastian, and left Amanda glaring after him with icy dislike. He came upon Ramsay in the supper-room. The tables were spread with the usual Almack's fare, which was simply thinly sliced bread and butter, plain cakes, lemonade, and tea. Ramsay had passed up the tea in favour of a glass of lemonade, but the bread and cakes didn't appear to tempt him. He stood turned half away, the glass of lemonade seemingly forgotten in one hand, the fingers of his other hand sliding up and down his watch chain as he stared into space. Sebastian's acquaintance with the man was slight. They might belong to the same clubs and at times frequent the same routes and balls, but they were separated by some 4 or 5 years and by a world of interests. Yet when Sebastian entered the supper-room, Ramsay left the table and walked right up to him. "And the woman whose body you showed Cedric Fairchild?" Ramsay threw a quick glance around and lowered his voice. "You're quite certain it was Rachel?" "Fairly certain, yes." Ramsay swallowed hard, his face going slack. He had even features and a pleasant enough face, only slightly marred by a weak chin. Sebastian said, "You knew she was missing?" Ramsay nodded. From the ballroom came the beginning strains of a Scottish reel. "Then you also know, presumably, why she ran away?" "No." The man's gaze had wandered, but he now brought it back to Sebastian's face. "I went to Curzon Street one day, planning to take her for a drive in the park, and Lady Fairchild told me Rachel was ill. They kept fobbing me off with one tale or another. Then they said she'd gone to Northamptonshire to recuperate." "So how did you realize she wasn't there?" "She never wrote to me. I finally went up to Fairchild Hall myself." His lips flattened into a straight line. "When the servants told me they hadn't seen her since shortly after Christmas, I drove straight back to Curzon Street and demanded the truth." "And?" "Lord Fairchild admitted she'd run away." "You had quarrelled?" Ramsay's eyes widened, his jaw sagging in denial. "No, never." "Then how do you explain her behaviour?" "I don't know. I looked for her everywhere. It was as if she just disappeared." Sebastian studied the other man's ashen face. He had not, obviously, thought to search the alleyways and brothels of Covent Garden. But then, who would? Ramsay dropped his voice even lower. "Cedric says you've involved yourself in this at the request of a woman who survived the fire." "That's right." "One of the whores?" "I'd rather not say." For some reason, the answer seemed to trouble Ramsay. He stood with the glass of lemonade still untasted, the fingers of his free hand fiddling now with the gold locket he wore at the end of his watch chain. Sebastian said, "People typically run away because they're angry, or because they're miserable, or because they're afraid. Was Rachel afraid of marriage?" A hint of colour touched the other man's pale cheeks. "Of course not. She couldn't wait to be married." "She was anxious to get away from her stepmother? The new Lady Fairchild?" Ramsay gave a surprised laugh. "Don't be ridiculous. The woman's a cipher, a shadow." "What about her father? How did Rachel get along with him?" "Lord Fairchild?" Ramsay shrugged. "I don't think she saw much of him, frankly. From what I understand, he's pretty much devoted himself to affairs of state. At least, since his first wife's death." Sebastian studied the other man's pale, haggard face. "It's curious, don't you think, that a gently born woman would flee her home and seek refuge in Covent Garden, only to run away again in fear less than a year later?" "What makes you think she ran away in fear?" It struck Sebastian as a curious question. "Can you think of another reason she would run away? Twice?" "I told you. I don't know." His gaze drifted back to the ballroom. "Now, you'll have to excuse me. I promised my sister this lemonade," he said, and brushed past Sebastian into the ballroom without a backward glance. Chapter 25. It was when Sebastian was leaving Almack's assembly rooms that he fell in with a small party that included Mr. Spencer Percival, the Prime Minister. "Evelyn," said the Prime Minister, excusing himself from his party, "walk with me away. I've been wanting to speak to you." The night was cold and clear, the bells of the city churches chiming the hour as the two men turned their steps towards St. James's. In his 50th year, the Prime Minister was a small, slender man, with a thin, smiling mouth, protuberant light eyes, and a rapidly receding hairline. "I'm concerned about your father," he said. "He doesn't look well these days." "Hendon eats too much, drinks too much, and smokes too much," said Sebastian, wondering how many times in one day he could have this same conversation. Percival laughed. "Don't we all?" Sebastian kept his peace, although in truth Spencer Percival was a temperate family man who spent whatever free time the affairs of state left him, either playing games with his children or searching the Bible for prophecies that he then wrote up and published in a series of religious pamphlets. "And how is Lady Percival? And the children?" Sebastian asked, deliberately changing the subject. "Lady Percival is well, thank you. And as for the children, well, they're growing up too fast," said the Prime Minister with that special smile that always lit his face when he spoke of his 6 sons and 6 daughters. "My eldest son will be heading off for Trinity College in the autumn." Sebastian eyed the tattered hackney carriage that had pulled in close to the curb ahead of them. A man wearing an evening cloak stepped down, but the hackney didn't move on, and the man stayed in the shadows. "I remember when Spence was off to Harrow." The Prime Minister smiled. "Makes one feel one's age, does it not?" The smile faded, and he worked his square jaw back and forth in a way that reminded Sebastian of Hendon. "My Jane tells me I'm worse than a nosy old woman, but here it is. I don't know what's happened between you and Hendon, but I do know it grieves him badly. There, that's all I've got to say on the matter. Just thought you ought to know, before it's too late." Sebastian swallowed a spurt of annoyance and said evenly, "I understand you dined with Sir William Hadley on Monday." "That's right, at Long's," said the Prime Minister with a rush of heartiness, as if this time he were thankful for the shift in topic. "The food was appalling. I've a good mind to quit going there." "What time did the evening break up?" "Not until midnight, at least. You know how it is. A room full of men with a steady supply of port, and a dozen different opinions as to why the country is going to rack and ruin." "Ah,
I thought I saw Sir William that evening at Covent Garden, but I must have been mistaken." "I don't know about that," said Percival. "You might have. Sir William arrived late, close on to 9 o'clock, if I remember correctly. Said something about—" He broke off as a man lurched toward them from out of the shadow of the waiting hackney. "There you are," said the gentleman, planting himself in the centre of the footpath with his hands clenched into fists at his side, the light from the nearest street lamp limning the side of his face. "Thought to avoid me again, did you?" A spasm of embarrassment passed over the Prime Minister's features. Like all well-bred Englishmen, Percival found public scenes mortifying. "Mr. Bellingham, I did not attend Almack's assembly in an effort to avoid you." The man was small and dark-haired, with a long face that looked prematurely aged. He might have been 50 or 60, but the blackness of his hair suggested an age nearer to 40. "All I demand is what is the birthright and privilege of every Englishman," said Bellingham, shoving his face up against Percival's. "How would your wife and family feel if you were torn from them for years, robbed of all your property and everything that makes life valuable?" Percival drew back, putting distance between them again. "You still have your wife and family, sir, and that is what makes life valuable." "Easy for you to say," sneered Bellingham, pivoting as Percival brushed past him. "You haven't been robbed of your liberty for years. Years!" "My good man," Percival swung to face him again, "I am sorry for your predicament, but it is not the place of the government to compensate you. Bring suit against this Israelite, if you will, but your business with me is done." Percival turned on his heel and continued walking, Sebastian at his side. Bellingham shouted after them, "You think you can shelter behind the imagined security of your status, but you can't. Do you hear me? You can't." Percival kept walking, his lips pressed into a tight line, the click of their boot heels on the flagstones sounding unnaturally loud in the sudden stillness of the night. Sebastian said, "Who the devil was that?" "John Bellingham." Percival drew his handkerchief and pressed the neatly folded cloth against his upper lip with a hand that was not quite steady. "The poor man was imprisoned for years under the most dreadful conditions in Archangel. He had accused a shyster by the name of Solomon Van Bremen of insurance fraud over a scuttled ship, and Van Bremen retaliated by scheming to have the Russians ruin him. Truly, the poor man has been most grievously wronged, but he seems to think he's entitled to £100,000 compensation from His Majesty's government, and that he is not." "He sounds mad." "He may very well be. I fear his sufferings have turned his mind." "You would do well to be careful," said Sebastian. Percival huffed a laugh. "Of Bellingham? I deal with his ilk most every day." Sebastian threw a glance over his shoulder. Bellingham still stood in the centre of the footpath, his small body rigid with rage and frustration, his dark head thrown back against the soft glow of the nearest oil lamp. "He might attempt to do you harm." "What would you have me do? Surround myself with bodyguards? Never venture forth in public or mingle with the people? What sort of leader would I be then?" "A live one," suggested Sebastian. But Percival only laughed again and shook his head. Chapter 26. Hero's plans to pay a call on Rachel Fairchild's older sister, Lady Sewell, were frustrated by Lady Jarvis, who insisted upon her daughter's company on a protracted shopping expedition that afternoon. As this was followed by an early departure for a dinner party being held that evening at the country house of one of Lady Jarvis's childhood friends, Hero resigned herself to putting off the visit to the next day. The estate of Sally, the Duchess of Laleham, lay only on the outskirts of Richmond, but Lord Jarvis insisted that both the footman and the coachman be armed, since they were travelling outside of London. At the end of the evening, as the carriage started on the long drive back to Berkeley Square shortly after midnight, Hero found herself unusually grateful for her father's precautions.
"It's the arsenic powder," Lady Jarvis was saying, as mother and daughter sat side by side, gently rocking with the motion of the carriage. "Or so I've heard. It utterly ruined her health, which is a pity, because Sally was quite lovely when she was young, but vain." "Hence the too liberal use of the arsenic powder," said Hero. "Yes." Lady Jarvis settled more comfortably against the plush seat and sighed. In contrast to her daughter's Juno-esque proportions, Lady Jarvis was a tiny woman, small of bone, with a head of once golden curls now fading gently to grey. "Yes," she said again, "but there's no denying it does give one the whitest skin. Sally was so lovely when she was young." It was one of Lady Jarvis's more irritating habits, this tendency to repeat nuggets of her conversation. Or at least it irritated her husband Charles, Lord Jarvis, to the point he could rarely tolerate her company. But Hero remembered a time when her mother had been different, when Lady Jarvis had been high-strung and emotional, but not half-mad and childlike. The light thrown by the carriage lamps bounced and swayed with the action of the horses and the bowling dips of the well-sprung chaise. Through the window, Hero caught a glimpse of a copse of birch trees, a flash of white trunks and darkly massed leaves against a black sky. The crisp evening air was heavy with the scent of ploughed fields and damp grass, and the lush fecundity of the countryside. Normally this was a journey Hero enjoyed, but tonight she found herself scanning the shadows and listening to the drumming of the horses' hooves on the deserted road. An inexplicable shiver coursed up her spine. "Are you cold, dear?" asked Lady Jarvis, leaning forward solicitously. "Would you like the rug?" "No, thank you," said Hero, annoyed with herself. The road might be deserted, but she was not one to imagine highwaymen behind every wall or stand of trees. "I'm fine." "The cream silk was a good choice," said Lady Jarvis, casting an approving eye over Hero's gown. "Better, I think, than the white I wanted you to wear." "Cream is always a better choice than white," said Hero, with a light laugh, her gaze still scanning the horizon. "White makes me look like a cadaver." Her mother shuddered. "Hero, the things you say! But you do look lovely tonight. You should crimp your hair more often." Hero swung her head to look at her mother and smile. "If you had any maternal feelings at all, you would have found some way to ensure that your daughter inherited all your lovely curls." Lady Jarvis looked troubled for a moment. Then her brow cleared. "Oh, you're funning me. As if I had anything to say about it." Hero felt a pain pull across her chest and turned her head to stare out the window again. She loved her mother dearly, but there were times when the contrast between the way Lady Jarvis was now and the way Hero remembered her was enough to bring the sting of tears to her eyes. The carriage lurched and swayed down a long hill, hemmed in on both sides by stands of dark trees undergrown with shrubs and gorse that pressed so close, Hero fancied she could reach out and touch their branches. She became aware of the carriage slowing as the horses dropped down to a trot, then came to a shuddering halt as coachman John reined in hard. "Why are we stopping?" demanded Lady Jarvis, sitting upright. Hero peered out the window at the horse and gig slewed across the road. "There appears to be a carriage in the way." A man stood at the horse's head, his voice a gentle murmur as he stroked the animal's neck and said soothingly, "Easy, girl, easy." "What's the trouble there?" shouted coachman John. "A broken trace," said the man, walking toward the carriage. By the pale light of the carriage lamps, Hero could see him quite clearly. He looked to be somewhere in his mid-30s, raw-boned and darkened as if from years under a tropical sun. But his accent was good, and he wore a neat round hat and a gentleman's driving cape which swirled around a fine pair of high-topped boots. As he paused near the box, she became aware of the sound of hoofbeats coming down the hill behind them. One horse, ridden fast. Her gaze travelled from the man in the road to the double-barrelled carriage pistol in a holster beside the door. The gentleman in the cape said,
If one of your footmen could help me move the gig out of the road, you can be on your way."
Reaching out, Hero slowly eased the carriage pistol from its holster. Lady Jarvis said, "What on earth are you—" Hero put out a hand, hushing her. Hero couldn't see the man who'd ridden up behind them, but she heard his horse snort.
"Need some help?" he called. "I think everything's under control," said the man in the road.
Reaching beneath his cape, he drew out a pistol and extended his arm so the muzzle pointed up at the box.
"Don't move." "What the bloody hell?" blustered the coachman. The man in the road said, "You'll notice my friend here has a gun as well. Throw down your weapons. We know you've got them."
Lady Jarvis's eyes went wide. "Oh, my goodness," she said in a panicked, high-pitched whisper. "Highwaymen! Hero, put that thing away. We must give them everything. Thank heavens I didn't wear the sapphires tonight, but there are your pearls." Hero put her hand over her mother's mouth.
"Hush, Mamma."
She heard muffled thuds as the two footmen threw down their guns.
The man in the road said, "You too, coachman."
The carriage shuddered as the big coachman shifted his weight. His blunderbuss landed with a thump in the grassy verge. Hero tightened her grip on the handle of the pistol and carefully eased back both hammers.
"You didn't tell me we was stopping a lord's rig," said the second man, nudging his horse forward into the lamplight. "Two ladies in a carriage like this ought to be sporting some nice baubles."
Hero watched him swing down from his horse. He was younger than the man in the cape, and more coarsely dressed. She steadied the heavy carriage pistol with both hands and pointed the barrel at the door.
"That's not what we're here for," snapped the caped man, shifting his stance so he could cover both the footman and coachman John. "Just make it quick before someone comes along. And make bloody sure you shoot the right woman."
A younger man laughed.
"I could tell a young un from an old un," he said, jerking open the carriage door.
Hero squeezed the first trigger and discharged the pistol straight in his face. The man's face dissolved in a bloody red shattering of skin and bone. The percussion was deafening, the carriage filling with a blue flash of flame and smoke, and the acrid smell of burned powder. Lady Jarvis screamed and kept screaming as the impact of the shot blew the man out of the carriage and flopped him back into the dirt of the road.
"Drummond!"
The gentleman in the cape whirled, the barrel of his gun levelling on the carriage door. Half falling to her knees on the carriage floor, Hero leaned out the carriage door and squeezed the second trigger. She shot higher than she'd meant to, and wilder, so that instead of hitting the man square in the chest, her bullet smashed into his right shoulder, spinning him around and sending his pistol flying out of his hand. "Quick!" Hero shouted to the servants. "Get his pistol!" She shoved up, only to sag slightly against the side of the open door. Now that it was over, her knees were shaking so badly she could hardly stand. "Is he dead?"
"Nah,"
said Coachman John, turning the caped gentleman over.
"But he's bleeding pretty bad, and he appears to have gone off in a swoon."
"This one's done for," said one of the footmen, Richard, bending over the first man she'd shot. "My God, look at that. He don't have a face no more." "Get that gig out of the middle of the road so we can drive on," said Hero, turning back to deal with her now hysterical mother. "Lady Jarvis has sustained a terrible fright."
"It would appear," said Paul Gibson, studying the chessboard before him, "that Sir William has his own reasons for discouraging any investigation of the Magdalen house fire."
Sebastian and the Irishman sat beside the empty hearth in the surgeon's parlour, the chessboard, a bottle of good French brandy, and 2 glasses on the table between them. The neighbourhood had long since settled into quiet, and only an occasional footfall could be heard passing in the street outside. From the distance came the cry of a night watchman making his rounds.
1 o'clock on a fine night, and all is well."
Sebastian said,
Just because he knew Rachel when she called herself Rose and entertained gentlemen in Orchard Street doesn't mean he knew she'd taken refuge at the Magdalen house.
He watched his friend move his rook to B3.
"Check," said Gibson, sitting back in his seat and reaching for the brandy bottle. "But it is highly suggestive. Sebastian crossed his arms at his chest and studied the board before him. In the Levant, if a young woman disgraces her family by loose, immoral conduct, the only way the family can regain their honour is to kill her. Some people think it's a Muslim custom, but it's not. All the religions of the area do it. Christians, Jews, Muslims, Druze. It's not religious. It's tribal. And it goes back to pre-biblical days when the Jews were just another Semitic tribe wandering the deserts of the Arabian Peninsula. Gibson refilled their glasses and set the brandy bottle aside with a light thump. This isn't the Levant. No, said Sebastian, moving his queen to E7. But Englishmen have also been known to kill unfaithful wives and wayward daughters. Gibson frowned down at the board. You think that's why Rachel fled Orchard Street and took refuge at the Magdalen house? Because her father discovered where she was? Her father, or her brother? I'd say Cedric Fairchild knew his sister was in Covent Garden. But why? That's what doesn't make any sense about any of this. How did she end up there in the first place? A lord's daughter? That I haven't figured out yet. Gibson leaned forward suddenly, his two hands coming up together. She could have had a secret lover, someone her father considered unsuitable. Rather than marry Ramsay, she fled to her lover, who then abandoned her and left her on the streets. Too ashamed to go home, she was forced into prostitution to survive. Sebastian sat back in his chair and laughed. If you ever decide to give up medicine, you could make a fortune writing lurid romances. That's possible, insisted Gibson. I suppose it is. Sebastian watched his friend move his queen to D5. The fact remains that however she came to be in Covent Garden, all three men have a motive for killing her. Both Lord Fairchild and Cedric Fairchild might well have wanted her dead for disgracing the family name, while Tristan Ramsay would hardly be the first man to kill a woman who rejected him. Gibson reached for his brandy glass. What about the other man you were telling me about, this purchasing agent? Luke O'Brien? His motive is roughly the same as Ramsay's. He wanted her enough to try to buy her out of the academy. According to Kane, she rejected him. So he flew into a rage and threatened to kill her? That sounds logical. She fled Orchard Street to get away from him. There's just one little detail that doesn't fit with any of these scenarios. Gibson frowned. What's that? According to both Joshua Walden and Tasmin Poole, 2 women fled the Orchard Street Academy last Wednesday night. Rachel and another Cyprian named Hannah Green. Sebastian made his final move and smiled. Checkmate. Gibson stared at the board. Bloody hell, why didn't I see that coming? Sebastian raised his head, his attention caught by the sound of a team driven at a fast clip up the street. There was a jingle of harness and the clatter of wheels over uneven cobbles as the carriage was reined in hard before the surgery. An instant later, a fist beat a lively tattoo on the street door. What the devil? Gibson lurched awkwardly upright. I'll get it, said Sebastian, grabbing a brace of candles as he headed up the narrow hall. The pounding came again, accompanied by a man's shouted, "Halloo!" Sebastian jerked back the bolt and yanked open the door. A liveried footman, his tricorn hat askew on his powdered hair, one fist raised to knock again, was caught off balance and practically fell into the hall. Sebastian gazed beyond him to the team of blood bays sidling nervously in the street, their plumed heads shaking. His eyes narrowing, Sebastian was studying the crest emblazoned on the carriage panel, when the door was thrust open, and an imperious female voice said, "Don't just stand there, help me." It took Sebastian a moment to realize she spoke not to him, but to a second footman, who now scrambled to let down the carriage steps. "George," snapped the woman's voice, recalling the first footman. "Come, take the man's shoulders while Richard takes his feet. Careful! He's bleeding quite dreadfully." Bleeding? Gibson limped toward the unconscious man the 2 footmen were easing through the carriage door. "No, don't lay him down in the street. Take him straight into the surgery. This way," said Gibson, hurrying before them. "Who is he?" asked Sebastian.
"A would-be assassin," said Miss Hero Jarvis, appearing in the open carriage door. A picture in a demure cream silk confection with a high waist and a skirt sodden dark with blood. She held a beaded reticule in one hand and what looked like a carriage pistol in the other. "We left one dead on the road from Richmond, but this one's still living. I'm hoping he'll survive long enough to tell us who hired him." Sebastian stepped forward to offer her his hand down.
"Who shot him?"
She handed him the carriage pistol, as if somewhat surprised to find she was still clutching it. It was a double-barreled French flintlock, and he saw that both barrels had been fired. "I did." Chapter 27. Stripped to the waist, his face ashen in the flickering candlelight, the man lay on a table in the front room of Paul Gibson's surgery. The room was silent except for a trickle of water as Gibson squeezed out a sponge in a pan of bloody water, the tin ringing as he knocked its edge. "Will he live?" asked Miss Jarvis from where she stood in the doorway.
"I don't know," said Gibson, not looking up. "The bullet shattered the right shoulder blade and nicked a major artery. He's lost a lot of blood."
"I tried to keep pressure on the wound."
Gibson nodded. "It's probably the only reason he's alive as it is."
Sebastian reached for the wounded man's torn and bloody cloak lying amidst his hastily discarded shirt, waistcoat and coat.
"Exceptionally fine tailoring for a highwayman."
"He's not a highwayman," said Miss Jarvis, watching him. "He called the man we left dead on the road Drummond. I remember hearing that name the night the Magdalen house was attacked." Without commenting, Sebastian began going through the injured man's pockets. "There's a purse with 40 guineas, but no identification," said Miss Jarvis. "I already checked." Sebastian glanced over at her.
"Did you check the man you left on the road?"
"No. My mother was hysterical. I took her home even before coming here. I'm afraid her nerves were quite overset by the incident." Sebastian finished going through the man's pockets. She was right. There was nothing to tell them who he was. "This one," she said, nodding to the silent man on the table, "was in charge. He spoke well, like a gentleman." Gibson made a pad of bandages to apply to the man's chest.
"He's certainly groomed like a gentleman. Cleanly shaven, hair neatly trimmed, fingernails manicured. Although, from the looks of him, I'd say he spent a fair amount of time in the sun."
Miss Jarvis watched with interest as the surgeon went about his task. "The other man was a rougher sort. He may be a hireling."
"With orders to kill you?"
"That's right." When he kept silent, a faint touch of colour darkened her cheekbones. She said crisply, "You don't need to tell me I brought this on myself." Sebastian tossed aside the assassin's garments and walked up to her. She stood tall and elegant and perfectly composed, despite her blood-drenched gown, and the fact that she'd just fought off 2 assassins and killed a man. She was an incredible woman. He said, "The men who attacked the Magdalen house last Monday killed 7 innocent women to get to 1 because they intended to leave no witnesses. Now they obviously know who you are." "But I don't know who they are," she said. And for the first time he caught an echo of fear in her voice.
"Whoever they are," said Gibson, tying off his bandages, "they're either incredibly courageous or incredibly foolhardy to go after the daughter of Lord Jarvis."
Sebastian shook his head.
"At this point, I suspect they realise they've no choice."
He watched her glance out the darkened window to where her carriage and footman awaited. She said, "I must get back to my mother. If he regains consciousness, if he says anything,
we'll let you know."
She brought her gaze back to Sebastian's face. "Have you discovered anything yet?"
"Only that you were right. The woman you met at the Magdalen house was, in all likelihood, Rachel Fairchild."
She nodded. He was only confirming what she'd already suspected. He noticed the way exhaustion had sharpened her features, making her eyes huge in a pale face.
He said, "It's what you wanted to know, isn't it? Who she was. Now you know. You can go back to writing petitions to Parliament or however you spend your time. Let your father deal with these people. God knows he's capable.
Have you discovered how Rachel Fairchild came to be there, in Covent Garden?
No.
Then I can't stop. She looked beyond him to Gibson. You will send the bill for the man's care to me.
As you wish, said Gibson.
She nodded again and left. Gibson stared after her. They could hear the jingle of harness, the clatter of hooves on cobbles as the carriage moved off.
Jesus, Mary, Joseph, and all the saints,
he said softly, then went back to work on the mangled man before him. Thursday, 7th of May, 1812. The next morning, Sebastian received some interesting intelligence from Jules Calhoun.
I've learned a wee bit more about your Mr. O'Brien, said Calhoun, putting away Sebastian's razor.
Sebastian finished buttoning his shirt and glanced around.
Oh? Not only is he held in the utmost esteem by the city's tradesmen, but he's trusted implicitly by his clients,
said the valet, holding out a crisply laundered cravat.
His commissions are reasonable, he never demands compensation from merchants, and he's a regular contributor to the Orphans' Fund.
Sebastian carefully wound the cravat's folds around his neck.
So how does he afford all the expensive pleasures of life? It's quite simple, actually. He's one of the biggest thieves working the Thames.
Sebastian looked around.
Now that is interesting.
It's a very clever arrangement when you think about it, said the valet.
His activities as a procurement agent mean he's constantly down on the docks dealing with shipments and going in and out of warehouses. From what I understand, the man's meticulous. Plans his operations to the most exacting detail, then executes them flawlessly. He's really quite brilliant. They say he's been behind every big job on the river in the past 5 years. His last enterprise cleaned out an entire warehouse full of Russian sables from just off the Ratcliffe Highway.
Sebastian shrugged into his coat.
Russian sables? Sir William mentioned something about Russian sables. When was this? Monday night, said Calhoun, holding out Sebastian's hat. Just hours after the attack on the Magdalen House.
Chapter 28. Luke O'Brien kept rooms in a well-tended stone house not far from the ancient pitched slate roofs and towering chimneys of St. Catherine's Hospital below the tower. A few simple inquiries in the area brought Sebastian to a small eating house, squeezed in between a ship's chandler and a biscuit baker. For this was a part of the city that made its living from the docks and the river that linked London with the sea and the world beyond. The eating house was simple but wholesome, the air filled with the smell of sizzling bacon and fresh bread, and boisterous conversations rising up from tables filled with ship's officers, customs men, and clerks. Luke O'Brien sat by himself at a small table near the front window. Sebastian nodded to a middle-aged woman with rosy cheeks and an apron tied over her expansive middle, and went to slide into the seat opposite the agent.
"I understand congratulations are in order," said Sebastian, keeping his voice low. "That was quite a successful enterprise you managed to pull off."
O'Brien glanced up from his plate and frowned.
"Do I know you?" "We've met."
O'Brien gave Sebastian a hard look, then grunted.
"So we have. You've lost 20 years and a good 2 stone in 24 hours. Quite a feat."
Sebastian smiled.
"It turns out that neither one of us is exactly what we first portrayed ourselves to be. You, for instance, are not just a purchasing agent."
O'Brien carefully cut a piece of bacon.
"And I take it, you're not really a Bow Street runner?"
"No." Sebastian paused while the apple-cheeked woman bustled up to take his order.
"Just tea, please," he told her with a smile.
After she'd gone, he brought his gaze back to the agent and said quietly,
"Nor am I interested in what happened to a certain warehouse full of Russian sables."
O'Brien chewed slowly and swallowed.
"So what are you interested in?" "The death of a young woman." "We went over all that."
"Did we?"
"I've learned a few things since then. For instance, Did you know Rose was really Rachel Fairchild, daughter of Basil, Lord Fairchild?"
The man's face gave nothing away.
"Who told you that?"
"This," said Sebastian, laying the silver bracelet on the table.
"Have you ever seen it?"
O'Brien's fork clattered against the side of his plate. He stared at the bracelet a moment, then lifted his gaze to Sebastian's.
"You obviously know it's hers. Where did you get it?" "From one of the whores at the academy. It used to belong to Rose."
"Yes." Picking up the bracelet, O'Brien studied the medallion with its crested helm and 3 eagle heads.
"You say she was a Fairchild. You didn't know?"
"No." If the man was lying, he was bloody good at it. But then, of course, he was good at it. His life depended upon it. Sebastian said,
"I understand Russian sables are very valuable."
O'Brien gave a slow smile.
"So they say. A man with that much to lose could be dangerous," said Sebastian, "if someone found out about his plans."
He paused while the plump-faced woman put his tea on the table before him. O'Brien said nothing.
"If he realized a woman knew what he did for a living, such a man might well intimidate her, bully her, just to keep her quiet. Except I can see a woman like Rachel, or Rose, getting scared. So scared she ran away, in which case then she'd really be a threat. A threat that needed to be tracked down and silenced before she ruined everything."
O'Brien tore off a piece of bread and used it to wipe up the egg yolk on his plate.
"A man doesn't stay in this business long if he doesn't learn to keep his mouth shut. I'm not that careless."
He popped the bread in his mouth, chewed and swallowed.
"If I was, I'd be in Botany Bay. Or dead. Mistakes happen. Not if you're careful. I'm very careful. I'm also not a violent man. Ask around the docks. Anyone will tell you. Sure, I have a temper. My father was Irish, after all."
He leaned forward.
"But a body'd have to be sick to kill all those women. Or very afraid."
O'Brien met Sebastian's gaze and held it.
"There's nothing I'm that afraid of."
Sebastian took a long sip of his tea.
"Kane tells me he wanted to buy Rose out of the house, but she refused." "He said that? Are you saying it's not true?"
"Are you kidding?"
"Of course she was willing. She hated Kane, and she hated that house." "Do you think that's why she ran away? Because of Kane?" "What would be the sense in that? I was getting her out of there."
O'Brien leaned his elbows on the table, his linked hands coming up to tap against his chin.
"The only thing I can figure is something must have happened, something that scared her. She just bolted." "So why didn't she bolt to you?" "Maybe she figured she'd be too easy to trace."
A wry smile tightened the flesh beside his eyes.
"Didn't take you long to find me now, did it?"
Sebastian studied the agent's dark, handsome face.
"Ian Kane says her departure meant nothing to him, that she was easily replaced."
O'Brien huffed a humorless laugh.
"What do you think? I was about to pay him £200 for her."
He leaned forward. He was no longer smiling.
"It sets a bad example for the other girls now, doesn't it, her taking off like that? I don't know what he told you, but the truth is, he was livid when he found out she'd run away. Said if he ever got his hands on her again, he'd kill her."
Chapter 29. Ian Kane sat on a folding stool amidst the tumble-down tombs and overgrown headstones of the churchyard of All Hallows, Barking, a paintbrush in one hand, a flat palette smeared with paint in the other. Balanced on the easel before him stood the canvas on which the north face of the church was beginning to emerge in a glory of sun-washed golds and blues and reds. Sebastian squinted up at the billowing clouds building overhead and said,
"You're about to lose your son."
"This is England," said Kane, his gaze on the church before him. "I always lose my son." Sebastian watched the brothel owner load his paintbrush with gold.
"I'd have thought a gloomy day more suited to your subject." You would, said Cain.
Sebastian gave a sharp laugh. The church was a curious blend of styles and materials, the massive round pillars and Gothic arches of the West End dating back to the 13th century, while the eastern end was much more recent, with a brick steeple that had been added only 150 years before.
I was 8 when I started in the mines, said Cain, squinting at the point where the church's old staircase turret wound toward a roof, badly in need of replacement. I was lucky. Most lads go down when they're only 6, some as young as 4. I was a pony boy. Did you know that they keep those poor beasts down in the mines until they die? Their hooves turn green. It's unnatural stabling horses a mile underground so they never see the sun.
He added a fleck of light to the painted turret on the canvas.
I like the sun.
The air filled with a gentle cooing from the pigeons roosting on the steeple. Cain painted for a few moments, then said,
What brings you sniffing around me again?
Sebastian leaned against the edge of a nearby lichen-covered tomb.
I found Luke O'Brien. That didn't take long. Did he confess to the murders?
No, but he provided me with some interesting information. He says Rose Fletcher was more than happy to let him buy her out of your house. Cain added a touch of blue to a clerestory window.
I don't buy and sell women. They make me sound like some bloody Yank.
Sebastian crossed his arms at his chest and leaned back.
Right. You were simply going to let O'Brien pay the woman's debts, with a handsome commission for you, of course. It's the English way, isn't it? Commissions. He also said you weren't as sanguine as you would have me believe about her precipitous departure. He says you were furious that she'd left. Furious enough to threaten to kill her if you found her.
Cain shrugged.
It's an easy thing to say, isn't it? I'd like to kill him, or I could kill her. People say it all the time. Not many follow through on it. Some do. I had no reason to kill her. Rose was a good source of revenue, but she wasn't irreplaceable. What good would killing her do me?
Sebastian said,
She was about to be sold, released, to O'Brien. So why would she run? You tell me. Maybe she saw something she wasn't supposed to see.
Cain threw him a sideways glance.
What are you imagining? Murder? Treason? Satanic rituals?
Sebastian met his gaze and held it.
I hadn't thought about the satanic rituals.
Cain swung back to his painting.
After a moment he said, A gentleman came to the house a couple of weeks ago. He was quite surprised to find Rose at the academy. Only he didn't call her Rose. He called her Rachel. A gentleman. Most definitely a gentleman. Not a scrambling functionary or schoolteacher or vicar, but a real gentleman.
Cain gave him a mean smile.
Like you. Only smaller, thinner, reddish-brown hair. Good-looking enough, I suppose, but he had a weak chin.
The church bells began to peal, startling the pigeons roosting on the tower, so that they flew up, their wings beating the air with a soft whirling sound, quickly lost amid the distant rattle of harness, and the crunch of iron-bound wheels over cobbles, and the cry of a chimney-sweep's boy shouting, "Weep! Weep!"
Sound like anyone you know?
Said Cain, one eyebrow raised in mocking inquiry. He waited a beat, then added,
My Lord Devlin?
Sebastian studied the clouds building overhead.
You had me followed, he said.
Cain squinted up at the sky.
There goes the sun. How's your man's arm?
Sebastian pushed away from the tomb as Cain flipped open a leather-bound wooden box, littered with paint-stained bottles and old rags at his feet.
An injury like that can incapacitate a man for a spell. I heard you'd tangled with a codger near the docks yesterday, said Cain, thrusting his palette and brushes into the box. I don't know who the fellow was.
He closed the lid on the box and snapped the fastenings before straightening.
But I do know this. It wasn't one of my lads." "Now, why should I believe you?" said Sebastian. "Believe me or not, as you choose. But your questions are obviously making someone uneasy."
Cain smiled and reached for his easel. In the pale light, the blue scar left across his forehead by his early years in the coal mines looked even darker.
"Uneasy enough to want to kill you?"
In his surgery near Tower Hill, Paul Gibson shifted on the hard wooden seat of his chair, his head tipped to one side as he listened to the wounded man's ragged breathing. Hero Jarvis's assailant had passed a restless night, drifting in and out of consciousness. Once he had startled awake, his grey eyes open wide, his lips parting as if on a gasp. Gibson had leaned forward to say softly, "What's your name?" But the man had only closed his eyes and turned his head away. Pushing to his feet, Gibson left the man's bedside and limped down the hall. The stump of his left leg was aching badly, giving him a slow, awkward gait. He answered a call of nature, then splashed water on his face and roughly towelled it dry. He was pouring himself a morning ale when he thought he heard a step in the hall.
"Anyone there?"
he called. The stillness of the surgery stretched out around him, raising a sudden, inexplicable length of gooseflesh on his arms.
"Who's there?"
he called again, setting aside the ale. He lurched toward the front room, torn between surging alarm and a feeling of profound foolishness. From the street outside came the shuffling hoofbeats of a passing horse, and the voice of a hawker crying, "Here I am with me rabbits hanging from me pole. All buy me rabbits." At the doorway, Gibson hesitated. The wounded man appeared to be sleeping peacefully, the sheet pulled up over his chest. It wasn't until Gibson limped over to the bedside that he saw the man's eyes staring wide open and sightless. Gibson put out one hand, touching the man's slack jaw, and watching the head loll. Someone had broken his neck. Chapter 30. Parting from Ian Cain outside the churchyard of All Hallows Barking, Sebastian went in search of Rachel Fairchild's one-time betrothed, Tristan Ramsay. He found him drinking Blue Ruin with Lord Alvin and Mr. Peter Dimsey at the Thatched House Tavern in St. James's. Walking up behind Ramsay's chair, Sebastian laid a heavy hand on the younger man's shoulder.
"We have something to discuss,"
said Sebastian, fixing his gaze on the other two men in a way that made both gentlemen shift uncomfortably in their seats.
"You gentlemen will excuse us."
Ramsay froze. "My friends and I are having a drink," he said with a nervous laugh. "Surely this can wait?" Sebastian kept his hand on Ramsay's shoulder.
"I think not."
Ramsay's gaze went from Sebastian to his friends. If he was hoping for any succour from either Alvin or Dimsey, he misjudged his friends. Both gentlemen had suddenly become wholly absorbed in the study of their drinks. "Perhaps, for a moment," he said, and thrust back his chair. They pushed through the crowded tavern to a narrow passage that led to a door opening onto a cobbled lane at the rear. Ramsay closed the door behind him with a snap and said, "Now, see here, Devlin." Moving calmly and deliberately, Sebastian whacked the back of his gloved hand across the man's face. He was in no mood for any more of Ramsay's bluster and lies. A different kind of man might have called Sebastian out for such an offence. Not Ramsay. Bloody hell! Both hands cupped protectively over his nose. He doubled over as if he'd been gut-punched. "You've drawn my cork." Picking up the man by his lapels, Sebastian slung Ramsay back against the brick wall behind him. "We're going to have a conversation. Only this time, you're going to be very careful not to lie to me." "What? What the hell is wrong with you? I didn't lie to you." "You did. You knew Rachel Fairchild was in Covent Garden. More than that, you knew exactly which house she was in." A tiny trickle of blood ran from Ramsay's left nostril. "What? I don't know what you're talking about. You went there.
Sebastian grabbed the man's shoulders and thumped his back against the wall again. "You like paying for it, do you, Ramsay? You like it when women have to do exactly what you tell them to do, when they moan on cue whether you're really bringing them pleasure or not. Must have been quite a shock to find your own fiancée lined up there with all the other soiled doves, offering her charms to any man with the money to pay for them." "Why, you—" Ramsay bucked against Sebastian's hold, his lips twisting with rage. "What I don't understand is how the hell you walked away and left her there." "I tried to get her to leave," said Ramsay, his breath blowing bloody bubbles out his nostril. "She wouldn't come with me. I had to pay for her just to talk to her. She took me upstairs to one of those awful rooms." His upper lip curled at the memory. "The bed reeked of stale sweat and sex. She reeked of sex. Of men. I begged her to come with me, but she just stood there listening to me with her arms crossed and a bored look on her face. Then she said, I only had 3 minutes left, so if I wanted to fuck her, then I'd better hurry up and do it." Sebastian studied the younger man's trembling chin as full understanding dawned on a tide of rage and revulsion. "And so you didn't you?" Sebastian let Ramsay go and took a step back before the urge to plant the bust at a facer grew overwhelming. "Mother of God! What manner of man are you?" Ramsay wiped his sleeve across his bloody upper lip. "You don't understand. She taunted me. She wanted it." "Is that what you told yourself? So you what? Fucked her there, in the upstairs room of a Covent Garden brothel, and then you just left her? What else was I supposed to do?" "You could have told her father where she was." "Lord Fairchild?" Ramsay looked appalled. "You think I wanted to kill him? The man has a weak heart." Sebastian studied Ramsay's blood-smeared features. "Did you find out how Rachel ended up in Covent Garden?" "No." "You did ask, didn't you?" "Of course I asked." "And she told you nothing? Nothing at all?" "She told me to go away and leave her alone." "Did you ever go back there?" Revulsion spread across the man's face. "Good God, what do you think I am?" "You don't want to know." Sebastian stooped to scoop up Ramsay's hat from the cobbles where it had been knocked in the scuffle. "Here," he said, slamming it against the man's chest. Ramsay's hands jerked up to close on the hat's brim. "Anyone would have done the same in my place," he said, clutching the hat to his chest. Sebastian studied the man's heightened colour and shifting, restless gaze. "You didn't try to talk her into leaving with you," said Sebastian, suddenly knowing it for the truth. "Oh, I've no doubt you ranted at her, demanded to know why she'd left you and how she could have done such a thing to you. But you didn't try to talk her into leaving. After all, what if she had said yes? What would you have done with her then? Taken her to wife?" Ramsay's head snapped back. "You say that as if you would have done any differently. What man would have wanted her after that? She was a whore." He must have seen something flare in Sebastian's eyes because he took a hasty step back. "All right," said Ramsay, breathing heavily enough to shudder his chest. "It's true. I didn't beg her to leave with me, but it isn't as if she asked me to take her away from there." "And that surprises you?" Ramsay raked the back of one hand across his upper lip. The bleeding was stopping now. "You don't know the way she treated me. The way she just stood there, swearing at me, talking to me like a—" He broke off. "Like?" prompted Sebastian. Ramsay sniffed and shook his head. "When was this?" Sebastian demanded. 2 weeks ago." Ramsay sniffed again. "Something like that. I don't remember for certain." 2 weeks ago. And you did nothing?" Ramsay carefully set his hat on his head. The crown was dented, giving him a rakish air. "I said I didn't tell Lord Fairchild. That doesn't mean I did nothing." "You astound me," said Sebastian.
What did you do?
Ramsay twitched his lapels and adjusted his cuffs.
I told her brother.
Chapter 31. Sebastian sat for a time on the terrace of the gardens overlooking Whitehall stairs. The patches of blue sky and intermittent sunshine of that morning had vanished behind thickening piles of grey clouds that shaded to black in the distance. The river flowed dark and choppy before him, whipped by the wind into white-flecked waves. A wherryman, halfway across the Thames, worked his oars with a strong, steady rhythm, the plash of his paddles hitting the water, carrying clearly in the strengthening breeze. Sebastian kept remembering the expression on Cedric Fairchild's face when first told of his sister's death in Covent Garden. The shock of denial had been all too readily apparent, that natural human tendency to disconnect when first confronted with the death of a loved one, the wailing mental "no" that is common to all. Yet Fairchild had displayed neither disbelief nor confusion when told of his sister's presence in Covent Garden. That brief bristling at the mention of the Magdalen house had all been for effect, because Cedric Fairchild had known only too well what his sister had become. Tristan Ramsay had told him. Sebastian slid off the low wall, his gaze lifting to the dark thunderclouds churning overhead. He understood why Cedric would attempt to keep the truth of his sister's disgrace to himself, even after her death. What he couldn't understand was why Rachel's brother, like her betrothed before her, had simply walked away and abandoned her to her fate. Rachel's brother was cupping wafers at Menton's, his right arm extended, steady and true, when Sebastian walked up to him.
"One would think you'd have had all the target practice you needed in Spain," said Sebastian, when Cedric Fairchild turned away from the firing range.
"It doesn't hurt to keep one's hand in," said Cedric. He had stripped down to his shirt sleeves and waistcoat to shoot. Now, handing his pistol to the attendant, he reached for his dark blue coat.
"You sold out and came back to London because of Rachel, didn't you?"
said Sebastian, watching the former lieutenant shrug into his coat.
"Who told you she was missing?"
"Ramsay." Cedric straightened his collar, his eyes narrowing.
"Actually, it was our sister, Lady Sewell."
A sudden burst of laughter from a group of men entering the room brought his head around.
"Walk with me," said Sebastian.
Buffeted by a cool wind, they strolled up the Mall toward Cockspur Street, with the rolling green swathe of St. James's Park stretching away to their right behind Carlton House and its gardens.
"There used to be a leper hospital there," said Cedric, looking across the park toward the river.
"Did you know? It was a pretty insalubrious place at the time, all swamps and marshland. They say a fair number of lepers from the hospital are still buried there. Every now and then the royal gardeners dig up some poor bastard's skull or thigh bone." Sebastian stared out across the carefully tended greens and clipped hedges of the gardens and the park beyond it. Beneath the cloudy afternoon sky, the park had assumed a cold, sombre aspect.
"They were outcasts," said Cedric,
"shunned even by their families.
Some were tradesmen, peasants, and labourers, but there were also noblemen, scholars, artists. It didn't matter. What they had been was superseded by what they'd become, something diseased and rotting, a threat to society."
Sebastian shifted his gaze to the man beside him.
"Is that how you thought of your sister?"
Cedric let out his breath in a harsh, grating sound.
"No, but it's how she thought of herself. You went to see her after Tristan Ramsay told you where he'd found her."
Cedric's face was ashen.
"I tried to get her to come away with me."
His lips flattened.
"She refused."
Tristan Ramsay had said much the same thing, but in Cedric's case, Sebastian was inclined to believe it was true.
"She said she was where she belonged. That house."
He broke off, swallowed.
"It was horrible seeing her there." "Did she tell you why she ran away?"
Cedric shook his head. I asked. She refused to say. They turned their steps toward Charing Cross and Northumberland House and Gardens beyond it. I still don't understand how she ended up there, said Cedric. He threw a sideways glance at Sebastian, pale features suddenly flushing dark with anger. But I swear to God, if you breathe a word of this to anyone, I'll kill you. Sebastian said, Do you think it's possible she was in love with another man? I mean someone other than Ramsay. Someone who lured her away from home, then abandoned her. Cedric thrust his hands into the pockets of his coat, his shoulders hunched. I admit I thought it possible. When I pressed her to leave with me, she just threw back her head and laughed. She said she was in love with that Lincolnshire fellow, the one who owns the house. Sebastian cast Cedric a sharp sideways glance. You believed her? He shook his head. She didn't look like a woman in love to me. If anything, I'd say she was afraid. Of Cain? I think she was afraid he'd kill her if she tried to leave. She said he'd killed before, other women who had tried to leave him. I told her she was being irrational, that we could protect her from the likes of some Covent Garden thug. He paused. She just told me to go away and not come back. And so you did. What else could I do? She refused to talk to me any more. When I went back last Saturday, they told me she was no longer there. He brought up both hands to scrub them across his face, his shoulders hunched. I thought they were lying, that she just didn't want to see me again. But a part of me was terrified something must have happened to her. What made you think that? Cedric knotted the fingers of his hands together, as if he were in prayer. I don't know. It was just a feeling I had. He hesitated. I remember this one time in Spain, just before Ciudad Rodrigo. A fellow by the name of Hobbs took out a patrol. They were late coming back. We'd had one of those bloody awful rains that can come up out of nowhere in the peninsula. Everyone was convinced they'd just used the storm as an excuse to spend the afternoon in a bodega somewhere. But you didn't think so? No. Cedric stared off across the gardens. They'd been ambushed. We found them not 2 miles outside camp. They'd been set upon by peasants with pitchforks and scythes. His face contorted with the memory. They were literally ripped apart. Both men were silent for a moment, lost in visions of the past, of men blooded and torn by cannon fire and bayonets as well as by pitchforks and scythes. Sebastian said, Did you tell Lord Fairchild that you'd found your sister? Cedric let out a sound that was like a laugh, only devoid of all humour. My father? He shook his head. My father isn't well. It would kill him if he knew what had happened to Rachel. Sometimes not knowing is worse than knowing. Not this time. Chapter 32. Hero gently closed the door to her mother's room and paused in the hall for a moment, her hand still on the knob, a weight of sadness pressing down on her. Lady Jarvis had reacted badly to last night's incident. Sometimes she worked herself up into such a state that it lasted for weeks. Her hand slipping off the knob, Hero was just turning away when her father came up to her. "How is your mother?" he asked. There was neither warmth nor caring in the question. "Resting. Dr. Ross has dosed her liberally with laudanum. She should sleep the rest of the day." Lord Jarvis's lips thinned into the pained expression he inevitably assumed whenever the topic under discussion was his wife. "That's a relief." His eyes narrowed as he studied Hero's face. "You're certain you're all right?" "Thanks to you teaching me to keep a steady finger on the trigger." Father and daughter shared a private smile. His smile faded quickly. "I've dismissed the 2 footmen you and your mother had with you last night." "It wasn't their fault." "Of course it was their fault," said Lord Jarvis. "I didn't send you into the country with 3 armed men to have you come back covered in some highwayman's gore." Hero opened her mouth, then shut it. Coachman John tells me you took the injured highwayman to Paul Gibson's surgery near Tower Hill. Why? I doubted the practitioners of Harley Street would appreciate the delivery of a bloody highwayman at midnight, and if I'd simply taken him to Bow Street, he'd have died. The man still lives? Last I heard, yes. Good. Then he can be made to talk.
Hero felt a chill prickle down her spine. She'd heard dark rumours of the methods employed by Lord Jarvis's henchmen to make people talk.
Papa?
Jarvis raised his hand, stopping her.
These men are connected to what happened last Monday, aren't they?
It would seem so, yes. He was so good at hiding his thoughts and feelings that even Hero often had a difficult time reading him. She was both shocked and touched when he suddenly said,
I'm concerned about you, Hero. You're all I have left.
I'll be careful, she promised. Reaching up, she brushed her father's cheek with a kiss and turned toward the stairs. But she was aware of him, still standing in the hall, watching her. Jarvis was in the small chamber he reserved for mixing snuff when his butler ushered Colonel Epsom Smith into the room.
You wanted to see me, my lord? Asked the colonel. What I want is to see this unpleasantness brought to an end, quickly.
Jarvis added a pinch of macuba to his mortar and began to grind it with a pestle.
You've had 2 days. What have you learned?
Epsom Smith stood in the centre of the room, his legs braced wide, his hands clasped behind his back.
Indications so far are that we're dealing with a simple tussle over merchandise. It's not clear yet precisely who is involved, but we're working on it.
Jarvis grunted.
Work faster.
Reaching for a small vial, he added 3 drops to his mixture.
You've heard of last night's incident? Yes, my lord. I'm not convinced, however, that it's related to Monday nights. It is. The surviving individual is at a surgery near Tower Hill. Use whatever means necessary, but make him talk. Yes, my lord.
Jarvis looked up from shaking his mixture out over the sheet of parchment that he'd spread across the room's table.
I also want one of your men watching over Miss Jarvis from now on. Discreetly, of course.
The colonel kept his face perfectly composed. If he'd learned yet of Hero's presence at the Magdalen house the night of the attack, he had more sense than to mention it. He bowed, said,
Yes, my lord,
and withdrew. Chapter 33. Sebastian arrived at Paul Gibson's surgery near the tower to find Miss Jarvis's town carriage drawn up in the street outside. The wind had turned cold, the team of matched off-white horses shifting restlessly in their traces, tails flicking away an endless buzz of flies. Tom studied the elegant equipage through narrowed eyes.
That's her, ain't it? The gentry mort what fooled me into leaving the chestnuts.
Sebastian handed him the reins.
I'd advise you to get over it, Tom. Miss Jarvis is like her father, brilliant and deadly. You don't want to tangle with her.
But Tom simply thrust out his lower lip in a mulish scowl and stared straight ahead. Sebastian jumped down from the curricle and was halfway across the footpath when the door to the surgery was yanked open.
"Oh, it's you,"
said Miss Jarvis, standing on the threshold, a formidable presence in a burgundy driving gown and matching velvet hat. Sebastian paused in mid-stride.
"Whom were you expecting?"
"The constables." She stepped back to allow him to enter. "Dr. Gibson sent for them shortly before I arrived."
"Is he all right?"
"No, he's dead." Sebastian knew a curious sensation as if the blood had suddenly drained away from his head. It was only the appearance of Paul Gibson himself at the entrance to his front room that brought the blood pounding back to Sebastian's temples when he realized she had spoken not of his friend, but of her assailant from the night before.
"I'm sorry,"
said Gibson, drying his hands on a rough towel.
"I was with him all night. I just stepped into the back to wash my face and grab something to eat." I couldn't have been gone 5 minutes. It's not your fault, said Sebastian, glancing at the silent, shrouded form on the bed. He was gravely wounded. True, but it wasn't his wound that killed him. Gibson went to flip back the sheet covering the dead man's face and shoulders. Someone came in here and broke his neck. Sebastian stared down at the dead man's pale features. Bloody hell. Did he ever say anything? Nothing of any significance. He was delirious. In and out of consciousness. I couldn't even get him to tell me his name. Bloody hell, said Sebastian again, only softly this time, for he'd remembered Miss Jarvis's presence. She said, Your arrival here is fortuitous. He looked around to find her still standing in the narrow hallway. How is that, Miss Jarvis? She retied the fluttering burgundy velvet ribbons of her hat with crisp no-nonsense movements. The woman had been born without an ounce of coquetry or flirtation, Sebastian thought, just intellect and lethal purposefulness. She said, I've arranged to meet the Cyprian from the Orchard Street Academy, Tasman Pool, at Billingsgate this morning. It is my hope that she might have discovered something else of interest. Billingsgate? Why Billingsgate? She raised one eyebrow in a gesture so reminiscent of Lord Jarvis himself that Sebastian felt a chill. You think Berkeley Square would have been more appropriate? Paul Gibson made a strangling noise in his throat and turned away. She looked Sebastian square in the eye and said, It occurs to me that you may have questions you'd like to ask her yourself. Sebastian met Miss Jarvis's frank gaze and saw there a faint hint of mockery lightly tinged with resentment. She obviously knew full well he was not telling her all the sordid details he was learning of Rachel Fairchild's life, and so she decided to listen to the questions he asked Tasman Pool and learn from them. He smiled. I have indeed, Miss Jarvis. Good. She turned toward the door. We'll take your curricle. To her maid she said, Jenna, you will await me in the carriage. The maid's eyes widened, but she simply dropped a meek curtsy. Yes, miss. Gibson let out a half-smothered laugh he turned into an improbable cough. Sebastian said softly to his friend, If I should disappear, you'll know where to tell them to search for my body, and followed Lord Jarvis's daughter out into the blustery afternoon. There's a reason we're taking my curricle, said Sebastian, helping Miss Jarvis up into his carriage's high seat. Care to tell me what it is? You're very perceptive, aren't you? She said, arranging her burgundy skirts around her. Ignoring Tom's fierce scowl, Sebastian hopped up beside her and gathered the reins. I do occasionally have these rare moments of blinding insight. A smile played about her lips. She opened her parasol. He said, There's no sun. It's there. It's just behind the clouds. He hesitated a moment, his gaze on her aquiline profile, then gave his horses the office to start. It's your father, isn't it? He said, when it was obvious she had no intention of answering his question. Someone has tried to kill you twice in the past week, and so Lord Jarvis has set one of his men to watching you. She turned her head to look at him. How did you know? I know Lord Jarvis. Sebastian deliberately swung his horses away from Billingsgate and the river. Over his shoulder he said to Tom, Anyone following us? Aye, there's a cove on a neat bay. Can you lose him? She asked. Probably, said Sebastian. Where precisely in Billingsgate are we going? St. Magnus. Sebastian gave a sharp laugh. No wonder you wished for me to accompany you. The church was on the edge of the rough-and-tumble fish market that had made Billingsgate famous. It wouldn't be as boisterous now as, say, at 5 o'clock on a Friday morning, but it was hardly the place for a lady. He glanced down at her fine burgundy skirt. People generally wear their oldest clothes to Billingsgate. Then we're both overdressed, aren't we? She threw a quick glance over her shoulder. How do you intend to lose him? Sebastian kept his attention on his horses. Ever visit St. Olaf's in Seething Lane? St. Olaf's? she repeated, not understanding. "The wife of Samuel Pepys is buried there." "I think," said Sebastian, guiding his horses between the vast warehouses of the East India Company, "that you've just been seized with an overwhelming desire to visit it." The church and its neglected churchyard lay in the shadow of one East India Company warehouse, and across the street from another. Sebastian drew up outside a gate adorned with 5 skulls. "Cheerful," said Miss Jarvis, eyeing the ancient moss-covered gateway. "More cheerful now than when Pepys described it overflowing with the high graves of hundreds of new plague victims." He handed the reins to Tom. "There's a cold wind blowing, so you'd best walk them, but don't go far." "Aye, Governor." Sebastian helped Miss Jarvis to alight, and noticed approvingly that she was careful not to let her gaze stray toward the dark-haired man reining in his bay at the end of the lane. "Now what?" she asked, walking beside him into the churchyard. "I will discourse at length on windows and corbels and the quaint gallery that once adorned the south side of the church, and you will look fascinated." "I'll try." They took a tour of the overgrown graveyard with its broken lichen-covered tombstones and leaning iron picket fence, then entered the church through a squeaky transept door. Miss Jarvis admired the organ gallery and the altar tomb of some obscure Elizabethan knight named Sir John Ratcliffe, who lay recumbent, with his dutiful wife kneeling beside him for all time. "I wonder where she is buried," said Miss Jarvis, eyeing that devoted spouse. "Sir John seems to have forgotten to provide for her. Perhaps she remarried some gallant courtier who didn't expect her to spend the rest of eternity praying on her knees." Miss Jarvis fixed her gaze upon him. "I'm impressed with your knowledge of London's obscure churches, but I must confess to a certain amount of confusion. What precisely have we accomplished by coming in here?" "That depends upon how close a watch your shadow was ordered to keep." The sound of the church door opening echoed through the nave. A gust of wind entered the church, stirring up the scent of old incense and dank stones and long-dead nights. Miss Jarvis's watchdog entered the church with his hat in his hands, his head turned away as he affected an intense study of the church's peculiar flat-topped windows. Sebastian touched Miss Jarvis's elbow, glanced toward the door, and whispered, "Quickly." Side by side, they strode through the porch and down the church's ancient, worn stone steps. The watchdog had left the reins of his horse looped over the iron railing of the churchyard. Walking up to the bay, Sebastian reached down and slipped his knife from the sheath in his boot. "Good heavens," said Miss Jarvis, watching him. Throwing back the stirrup leather, Sebastian calmly sliced through the bay's cinch as the horse nickered softly and swung its head to nose at Miss Jarvis's reticule. A shout arose from the church porch. "Bloody hell! What the bloody hell do you think you're doing?" "I don't like being followed," said Sebastian, as Tom drew the curricle in beside them. "Bloody hell," said the shadow again, hopping from one foot to the other, his face a study of anger and chagrin, mingling now with a touch of consternation. Sebastian handed Miss Jarvis into the curricle and scrambled up behind her. "Your father will hear of this," he warned her, giving his horses the office to start. The chestnuts sprang forward. Miss Jarvis unfurled her parasol and held it aloft. "I can deal with my father." Sebastian steadied his horses. He was beginning to acquire a measure of sympathy for the king's powerful cousin. Chapter 34. Sebastian smelled the fish market long before he could see it. As they neared the steps, an increasingly sharp odour like seaweed filled the damp air, the cries of gulls mingling with a buzz of raucous voices and the shouts of white-aproned salesmen standing on their tables and roaring their prices. "There she is," said Miss Jarvis, nodding to the long-necked Jamaican who stood on the footpath. With the fingers of one hand, the Cyprian clutched together a drab cloak she wore to cover her Covent Garden finery. She glanced around nervously, Her brown eyes open wide enough to show a rim of the dusky blue whites surrounding her irises.
"Welcome,"
said Sebastian, handing the reins to Tom. The tiger threw Miss Jarvis a malevolent glare.
"Aye, governor."
"Was he really a pickpocket?" asked Miss Jarvis, accepting Sebastian's arm to cross the raucous width of Lower Thames Street.
"It was either that or starve," said Sebastian.
She released his arm the instant they reached the far footpath.
"It's a curious conceit," she said, "hiring a pickpocket as your tiger."
"Tom's good with horses."
The boy had also saved Sebastian's life, but he saw no reason to add that.
"I didn't think you was going to come,"
said Tasmin Poole as Hero walked up to her. Since the last time Sebastian had seen the Cyprian, someone had obviously worked her over with his fists, leaving her with a discoloured cheek and a split lip. She threw a narrowed glance at Sebastian.
"What's he doing here?"
"He's also interested in what happened to Rose." The Cyprian sniffed and held out her hand, palm up, fingers crooked.
"You said you'd give me £5 just for showing up here."
"With the promise of more," said Miss Jarvis, passing the woman a small cloth purse, "if you can provide me with the information I seek." The purse disappeared quickly amidst the woman's clothes. Most whores cleared little or nothing from the long lines of customers they laboured every night to service. These were earnings the girl wouldn't need to share with her keepers. Precious indeed. Miss Jarvis said,
"Have you learned anything more about Hannah Green?" "People are looking at us queer," said Tasmin, turning toward the fish market. "We need to keep moving."
Miss Jarvis plunged after her into a malodorous crowd of men in shiny corduroy jackets and greasy caps. A woman with the limp tails of codfish dangling from her apron brushed past with a sibilant hiss, her elbows clearing a path as she went. A porter, bent nearly double beneath a huge dripping hamper that had soaked the shoulders and back of his canvas coat, barked,
"Move on there! Move on!"
Miss Jarvis whisked her skirts out of the way and kept going.
"Have you learned more about Hannah Green?"
Tasmin Poole said,
"I got 1 or 2 ideas about where she might be, but I ain't had time to go there yet."
"Where?"
asked Sebastian. The woman glanced over at him.
"If I tell you, and you find her, then she—"
here Tasmin jerked her head toward Miss Jarvis, "would give me my money." Miss Jarvis said, "You'll be paid for any information that enables us to find Hannah Green. I've told you that." Tasmin Poole stared out at the tangled rigging of the oyster boats moored along the wharf, each with its own black signboard and milling crowd of men and women massed around a white-aproned salesman. She bit her lip, obviously weighing the odds of being given a chance to track down the missing Hannah Green herself, against the risk of divulging her information here and now. At last she said,
"Hannah used to work the Haymarket before she come to the academy. She might have bolted back there."
Sebastian said,
"I've been told Rose was in love with Ian Kane. Is that true?"
Tasmin Poole's laugh was a melodious peal of merriment that brought to mind palm trees swaying in a soft tropical breeze.
"That's rich, all right."
Miss Jarvis cast Sebastian a sharp look. He knew it was only with effort that she kept from demanding, "And who is Ian Kane?" To Tasmin, Sebastian said,
"I take it Rose wasn't particularly fond of Mr. Kane?"
"She despised him,"
said Tasmin Poole. She'd caught the eye of a red-capped fisherman in a striped jersey sitting on the side of his boat and smoking a clay pipe. The fisherman smiled, and Tasmin smiled back. Sebastian said,
"For any particular reason?"
Tasmin brought her gaze back to Sebastian's face.
"You mean, apart from the fact Kane's a mean son of a bitch?"
"Yeah.
He's hard on all his girls, but he was hardest of all on Rose. It was like he was trying to break her. Never did, though."
"She was afraid of him," said Miss Jarvis. Tasmin threw her a scornful look.
"We're all afraid of him. But Rose—"
She broke off.
"Yes?"
prompted Miss Jarvis.
"Rose was afraid of someone else. She come to the academy afraid."
"Any idea who she was afraid of?"
asked Sebastian. The Jamaican twitched one thin shoulder. She never was one to talk to the rest of us."
She tipped her head to one side, her gaze thoughtful as she glanced from Miss Jarvis to Sebastian, then back.
"You keep talking about Rose and Hannah, but you never asked nothing about Hessie."
Sebastian sidestepped a barrel piled high with black oyster sacks.
"Who?" "Hessie Abrahams. She was another girl at the house. She left the same night as the other two."
"Why didn't you tell me about her before?" said Miss Jarvis, sounding ever so slightly aggrieved. Again that faint twitch of the shoulder.
"I didn't think you was interested. You only asked about Rose and Hannah." "You're certain this Hessie Abrahams left with the other two women?" asked Sebastian. "Well, she sure ain't been seen since."
For one startled moment, Sebastian's gaze met Miss Jarvis's. The air filled with the cries of the fish salesman shouting,
"Handsome cod! All alive, 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 oh!" and "Here, this way for a splendid skate."
Tasmin Poole's fingers crept up to touch her split lip. Then she must have realized what she was doing, because her hand fluttered away, and she stared off across the shed with its piles of reddish-brown shrimp and white-bellied turbots gleaming like mother-of-pearl in the gloom.
"Looks like someone worked you over pretty good," said Sebastian.
The Cyprian's palm cupped her bruised cheek, her lip curling.
"Bloody magistrate." "Sir William," said Sebastian.
She lifted her brown gaze to his.
"That's right."
She spit the words out contemptuously.
"He likes it rough. Sometimes he gets carried away. This is nothing. You should have seen what he did to Sarah once. Broke 2 of her ribs. She couldn't work for near a month."
"Did he come to the house last week?" Sebastian asked suddenly.
"Maybe. I don't know,"
said the Jamaican warily.
"Which night?"
"I tell you, I don't know."
Suddenly frightened, she gripped the folds of her cloak more tightly around her. "I need to be getting back."
She threw an avaricious glance at Miss Jarvis.
"You find Hannah Green in Haymarket. I get my money."
It wasn't a question. Miss Jarvis said, "Just tell me where to meet you and when."
"I'll contact you."
"You don't know who I am." The Cyprian laughed.
"I know who you are," she said,
and slipped away through the crowd gathered around an oak-sided Dutch eel-boat. Sebastian stared down at the pierced coffin-shaped barges floating at the eel-boat's stern. He'd never liked eels, ever since he'd watched as a boy when the half-eaten body of a drowned wherryman was pulled from the river, a dozen long black eels sliding sinuously away from it. Miss Jarvis said, "You've heard of this Sir William before. Who is he?" Sebastian swung his head to look at her.
"Sir William Hadley."
"From Bow Street?"
"The very one."
To his surprise, she let out a sharp laugh. "And my father pressured him not to investigate the fire. Now that's rich." Thunder rumbled in the distance. Sebastian squinted up at the sky.
"We should have brought your carriage. It's going to rain."
They turned their steps back toward the bridge. She said, "I gather Ian Kane is the man who owns the Orchard Street Academy?"
"That's right."
"Lord Devlin?" She swung to face him, oblivious to the red-cheeked fishmonger at her side, shouting, "Oh, by Brillo! Brillo!" She said, "What else do you know that you're not telling me?" He met her indignant stare with a bland smile.
"Miss Jarvis, I'm not some Bow Street runner you hired to give you daily reports."
She was an inch or two shorter than he, but she still managed to look down her nose at him. "I would think that common courtesy—"
"Courtesy?"
He jerked her out of the way just as the fishmonger in the nearest stall slopped a bucket of water across his marble slab.
"Believe me, Miss Jarvis, it is courtesy that prevents me from regaling you with the sordid details of this murder."
"If I were a man, or if I'd asked for your assistance in discovering the facts surrounding the murder of a cleric of impeccable character, you would tell me."
"Probably,"
he said slowly, not sure where she was going with this. "Then I would like to point out to you that in this case ignorance is not bliss. Last night,
2 men tried to kill me because of what I do not know." They had reached that part of Billingsgate known colloquially as Oyster Street, from all the oyster boats drawn up at the wharf. Sebastian stared at the bobbing red cap of a man in the hold of the nearest boat, his spade rattling over the grey mass of sand and shells at his feet. "Believe me, Miss Jarvis, you don't want to hear about this." "On the contrary, my Lord Devlin, I do." He studied her squarely held shoulders, the contemptuous twist of her lips. "Very well, Miss Jarvis. I will tell you. Ian Kane is an ex-miner from Lancashire who enjoys painting nude women and sunlit buildings. He also, in all likelihood, murdered his first wife. Whether or not he murdered Rachel Fairchild, I do not know, but he certainly expressed a desire to do so, seeing as how, when she ran away from his house last Wednesday, he was on the verge of selling her to a customer for £200. Selling her? That's right. We don't quite put our women and children up on the auction block like the Americans, but we still sell 4-year-olds to chimney sweeps, and nubile young women to anyone with a coin to buy them." He hesitated. She stared back at him, tight-lipped, and said, "Go on." "Very well. The customer in question, let's just call him Luke, shall we? It seems that Luke is a thief, a very successful thief, who, incidentally, had an ambitious project scheduled for Monday night just hours after the murders in Covent Garden. Is that significant? I don't know." Her face was quite pale, but all she said was, "What else?" "Well, then there's Rachel's betrothed, the inappropriately named Tristan Ramsay. It seems Mr. Ramsay was very well aware of the fact that his future bride was not in Northamptonshire recuperating her health. In fact, he knew she was at the Orchard Street Academy." "How did he know that?" "He went there as a customer." He left it at that. Hero Jarvis might bring out the worst in Sebastian, but he wasn't so ignoble as to tell her what Ramsay had done to Rachel there, on the stained sheets of that Covent Garden brothel. He said instead, "Ramsay told Rachel's brother, Cedric Fairchild, where she was. According to Cedric Fairchild, he went to see her last week, but she refused to leave with him. Both men claim they don't know why she ran away from home, or how she ended up in Covent Garden." Miss Jarvis sucked in a deep breath that stirred the once jaunty ribbons of her hat, now wet and limp. 2 tiny lines appeared between her brows as she studied his face. He wondered what she saw there. "But you know, don't you?" she said. "Or at least, you have some idea." He stared out over the stairs of Billingsgate to the wind-whipped, choppy brown river. He was thinking about the leper colony that had once stood in the marshes of what had since become St. James's Park, and what Rachel had told her brother about the diseased and rotting outcasts who threatened society. "Tell me," said Miss Jarvis. He swung his head to look at her wind-blown brown hair, and her once fine burgundy carriage dress, now ruined by the slime and muck of the fish market. She was brilliant and well-educated, and more aware of the harsh realities of the world than most women of her station. But the explanation that was beginning to take shape in his mind was too raw, too ugly to be spoken aloud. He shook his head. "I honestly don't know." She didn't believe him, of course. She remained uncharacteristically silent, her lips pressed into a thin, straight line, her shoulders stiff as he guided her to where Tom was walking the chestnuts up and down the lane. He handed her up into the curricle. She remained withdrawn, lost in her own thoughts, until he swung the horses out into traffic and headed upriver, away from where she'd left her own carriage awaiting her outside Paul Gibson's surgery. "This isn't the way to the tower," she said suddenly, looking around. Sebastian set his horses at a brisk trot toward Upper Thames Street. "I thought you might enjoy coming with me to pay a call on Sir William." She cast him a withering glance. "No, you didn't. You want me there for some other reason. What is it?" He gave her a wry smile. "You're quite right, Miss Jarvis. My motives are entirely disreputable. I'm simply looking forward to watching Sir William explain to Lord Jarvis's daughter his own involvement in the murder Lord Jarvis ordered him not to investigate.
Chapter 35.
"Keep 'em warm," said Sebastian, pulling up in front of the Bow Street public office and handing Tom the reins. Tom blew out a long breath through the gap in his front teeth and tried to look nonchalant.
"I reckon maybe I'll walk 'em around the block," he said,
casting an uneasy glance at the bustling entrance to the public office.
"One might almost imagine,"
observed Miss Jarvis, as Sebastian ushered her into the smoky, pungent din of the public office,
"that your tiger finds a prospect of lingering too close to Bow Street a decidedly uncomfortable proposition."
"One might,"
Sebastian agreed.
The public office was crowded with the usual assortment of beggars and pickpockets, constables and barristers. He collared a harried, buck-toothed clerk who tried to brush past them. "Miss Hero Jarvis and Lord Devlin to see Sir William." The clerk cast a dubious eye over their slime-smeared clothes, his thin nose twitching as the smell of oysters and hake and brill engulfed him.
"I'm afraid Sir William has left strict instructions that he never be disturbed for an hour after."
"If you think," said Sebastian, with that icy self-composure only the son and heir of an earl could achieve, "that Sir William will thank you for leaving Lord Jarvis's daughter waiting in the common lobby of a public office, you obviously have not considered the matter." The clerk was a pale-skinned man, with protuberant eyes, and a short upper lip that refused to cover his pronounced front teeth. He swallowed convulsively, his Adam's apple bouncing up and down above his modest cravat.
"Lord Jarvis's daughter—"
He broke off, his eyes bulging even more.
"Please follow me,"
he said, tripping over his own feet in his haste to lead them up the stairs to the private apartments overhead. He escorted them to a small anteroom, then paused.
"If you'll just wait here,"
he whispered, extending both hands out, palm flat, in a gesture reminiscent of someone quieting a congregation. The man should have been a cleric, Sebastian thought, instead of a clerk.
"I'll tell Sir William you're here."
"Why do I get the impression Sir William makes it a habit of slipping away from his duties every afternoon for an hour's nap?"
said Miss Jarvis, as she watched the clerk creep through the door to their left. "I suspect you're—" He broke off as a wailing shriek arose from the far side of the door. "What the devil?" Miss Jarvis reached the door before him, pushing it open without ceremony. The room was small, a cross between an office and a storage room overflowing with untidy files. The clerk stood just inside the door, his mouth now opening and closing silently on his large front teeth. Sir William half sat, half lay in an awkward pose in a padded chair behind a battered oak desk, his eyes wide and staring, his jaw slack, his head lolling at an unnatural angle. Sebastian expected Miss Jarvis to scream. Instead, she said calmly, "Good heavens, someone's broken his neck." Jules Calhoun's nose twitched. "What is that smell?" "Fish." Sebastian tossed his coat to one side and stripped off his waistcoat. "I need a bath." "It's coming, my lord," said the valet, picking up the offending coat with one crooked finger and heading for the door. "Oh, and Calhoun?" The valet turned. "My lord?" "Somewhere in this city are two whores who formerly graced the parlour of the Orchard Street Academy. One, named Hessie Abrahams, hasn't been seen since Wednesday of last week. The other, Hannah Green, arrived at the Magdalen House with Rose Fletcher, but fled before the fire. She may or may not have gone to ground in the Haymarket. I need to talk to both of them, if they're still alive." "If they're alive, I'll find them, my lord," said Calhoun, and bowed himself out. Scrubbed clean of the last lingering traces of Billingsgate, Sebastian prowled the West End, from the clubs of St. James's to the pleasure haunts of Covent Garden. He was looking for the malaria-plagued hussar captain from Northamptonshire, named Patrick Somerville, and finally ran him to ground in the Crown and Thorn, a tavern near Whitehall,
popular with both military men and sporting young men from the country.
"Any luck yet, locating your missing friend?"
asked Sebastian, pausing beside Somerville's table, where he sat with his chin sunk against his chest and shoulders hunched as if against the cold.
Somerville looked up and shook his head. "We haven't found a trace of him."
Pulling out a chair, Sebastian signalled a passing waiter and ordered 2 more pints.
"I understand you served in Africa," he said casually. "Yes, Egypt," said Somerville, "as well as the Sudan and Cape Town. I spent some time in Egypt myself, but I never went below the Sahara."
They spoke for a time of Africa and the Americas, slipping easily into that camaraderie known to soldiers everywhere. Sebastian took his time bringing the conversation around to the Fairchilds.
"You grew up in Northamptonshire, I take it?"
he asked casually.
"Wansford."
Reaching into his pocket, Somerville tipped the contents of a rice paper packet of white powder into one palm. He licked it clean, then gulped his beer as a chaser.
"Quinine,"
he said, when he became aware of Sebastian watching him.
"With a little added kick of arsenic."
The man gave a wry grin.
"It's a winning combination. Africa would be lost to us without it."
Sebastian said,
"Was Cedric Fairchild with you in Africa?"
"Cedric? No. We've known each other since we were in leading strings. My father's land marches with Lord Fairchild's estate."
"Then you know his sister Rachel?"
Sebastian deliberately kept the sentence in the present tense. Somerville nodded.
"She used to come over and play with my sisters when she was little."
Sebastian smiled.
"How many sisters do you have?"
Somerville gave a mock groan.
5. My father claims buying a pair of colours is nothing compared to the cost of a London season." "How many still left to go off?"
4.
Fortunately, Mary, the eldest, managed to do quite well for herself. Married Lord Berridge, you know. She's promised to sponsor her younger sisters when the time comes. My father's relieved, I can tell you. He always hoped Cedric would take a fancy to one of them, but I'm afraid Cedric always looked upon my sisters as if they were his sisters too." "I imagine they were often at Fairchild Hall."
"Well, no," said Somerville. His eyes were bright, feverish, with a deadly combination of sickness and arsenic.
"As a matter of fact, my father would never let any of them go over there."
The captain hesitated, then leaned forward to add softly,
"He always said Lord Fairchild was a tad too fond of little girls, if you know what I mean."
Sebastian took a slow sip of his beer. A tad too fond of little girls. It was a polite, euphemistic expression for something so ugly and bestial most Englishmen found it difficult to admit it actually existed in their oh-so-proper and painfully civil society. If Somerville hadn't imbibed so many beers, Sebastian doubted the man would even have mentioned it. Had there been rumours around the village of Wansford, Sebastian wondered? Tales of frightened little girls? Servants who caught glimpses of what was meant to be hidden? Sebastian couldn't even say exactly what had first raised the suspicion in his head. There couldn't be that many reasons a gently bred young woman would flee her home to end her days on the streets. Yet Rachel Fairchild had run away twice. Once from the Fairchild townhouse in Curzon Street, then again from the academy in Covent Garden. Were the 2 flights linked? Or had the first merely exposed her to the danger that had led to the second and, ultimately, to her death? Sebastian regarded the young man beside him.
"Tell me about the First Lady Fairchild."
"Lady Fairchild?" Somerville looked surprised.
"She was French, you know. An émigrée. I remember she always wore a red velvet band around her neck, in memory of some relative or other who'd been guillotined."
He brought up one hand to touch his throat.
"It fascinated me when I was a lad, but I don't recall much else about her. I was still at Eton when she died."
"Was she ill for long?"
"Ill? Hardly. She was shot."
"Shot?" Somerville nodded.
Lord Fairchild himself found her in the pavilion. You know, one of those follies built like a Greek temple. By the lake. The inquest decided it was some poacher shot gone wild, but, well..."
Somerville shrugged.
People will talk."
"They thought it was murder."
"Murder? Oh, no."
Somerville drained his tankard.
"They thought it was suicide. But then, what were they going to do? Bury her ladyship at the crossroads with a stake through her heart? They returned a verdict of death by misadventure, and Lady Fairchild now sleeps peacefully in the family tomb."
"Buy you another beer?" offered Sebastian. The captain looked at his tankard as if startled to discover it empty.
"I thank you, but no."
He set the tankard aside and rose to his feet.
"I promised my sister Mary I'd take her for a drive around the park this afternoon. Since I've been posted back here to London, she's decided to make good use of me. She's lined me up for everything from Lady Melbourne's famous picnic this Saturday to some grand ball or t'other. I can't remember when. It's enough to make a man look upon forced marches and month-long sieges with something approaching fondness."
Smiling faintly, Somerville gave a casual salute and turned toward the door. It was when Sebastian was leaving the Crown and Thorn that he very nearly walked straight into the Earl of Hendon. Both father and son took a startled, awkward step back, and for one blazing moment their gazes met and held. They had encountered each other in this manner a dozen times or more over the past 8 months, and each time Sebastian had felt the same shaking rush of anger and betrayal, the same brutal reminder of all he was trying to forget. He thought that, in time, he might be able to forgive Hendon for the lies, for the wretched coil Sebastian knew was not intentional, even if it was of Hendon's making. But Sebastian wasn't sure how he was ever going to forgive Hendon for the triumphant joy Sebastian had glimpsed in his father's face, the day Sebastian's world had come crashing down around him. He was aware of the leap of hope in his father's eyes, saw, too, when hope faded into hurt. With painful politeness, Sebastian executed a short bow, said, "Good evening, sir," and withdrew. Chapter 36. Having bathed and exchanged her ruined burgundy carriage dress for a walking dress of soft fawn alpaca, Hero sallied forth again, this time to pay her long-delayed call on Rachel's sister, Lady Sewell. The former Georgina Fairchild had married a middle-aged baronet named Sir Anthony Sewell. Sewell was comfortably rather than excessively wealthy, his house on Hanover Square well appointed but modest. The match had surprised many, for Georgina Fairchild was both attractive and well-dowered, yet she had contracted this unspectacular alliance just halfway through her first season. Hero Jarvis was not the type of female to interest herself in such gossip and speculation, but she nevertheless found herself contemplating possible explanations as she followed Lady Sewell's butler up the stairs to the Sewells' drawing-room. She discovered Lady Sewell already entertaining visitors. One, a flaxen-haired, plump-faced young woman in pink muslin, Hero recognized as Lady Jane Collins. She sat on a red damask sofa beside a sprightly older woman introduced to Hero as Miss Moore. Miss Moore was the well-known author of numerous best-selling tracts on Christian piety, and it soon became obvious to Hero that Lady Sewell, too, was something of an evangelical.
"We've just been discussing this dreadful new poem that has taken the Don by storm," said Lady Jane, shaking her head and tut-tutting in a way one might expect of a woman 30 years older. "Shocking, positively shocking."
Hero glanced at Lady Sewell. Tall and slim, wearing a high-necked crimson gown of figured muslin, she sat in a chair covered in the same red and gold-striped silk that hung at the windows. The room was dramatically yet tastefully done. The vibrant palette became its owner, for she was dark of hair and pale of skin, with exquisite high cheekbones and enormous green eyes. Except for the tall, slender nature of her build and those green eyes, there was nothing about this intense, self-contained woman to remind Hero of the frightened Cyprian she had met in Covent Garden. "Lady Jane is referring to Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, of course," said Lady Sewell. "Have you read it, Miss Jarvis?" Hero was torn between her natural tendency for blunt honesty
and the need not to alienate Rachel's sister. Whatever she thought of the absurd posturing of Lord Byron himself, Hero found his poem both lyrically written and profoundly emotionally evocative. She compromised by simply saying, "I have read it, yes. The profane, too, have their place in God's plan," intoned Miss Moore, with all the moral authority of a woman who'd spent the last 30 years of her life writing improving religious tracts. "They serve to confirm the truths they mean to oppose." "Vice-enhancing virtue, by contrast," said Hero dryly. Miss Moore's pinched lips stretched into a smile. "Exactly." Hero suppressed the urge to shift restlessly in her striped silk chair. She could hardly bring up Rachel with the two evangelical ladies present. Yet propriety limited Hero's own visit to 15 minutes. If they didn't leave soon— As if on cue, Miss Moore and Lady Jane rose to their feet, and after reassuring themselves of Lady Sewell's plans to attend the next meeting of the London Society for the Promotion of Christianity among the Jews, took their leave. Hero waited until she heard their footsteps descending the stairs, then said, "I met your sister Rachel the other day." Lady Sewell sat very still. "My sister?" Hero pushed on. "You're very different from each other, are you not?" Lady Sewell smoothed her skirt over her knee with a hand that was not quite steady. "That's right. Rachel takes after our mother." Hero studied the other woman's composed features. Either Lady Sewell was an incredibly cold woman, or she had no idea where Hero was going. She said more gently, "You haven't been told, have you?" "Been told? Been told what?" How did you tell a woman her little sister had been murdered? Hero had never been very good at this sort of thing. She said bluntly, "I'm sorry. Rachel is dead." Lady Sewell's mouth sagged open, then closed, the muscles jumping along her tight jaw. "There must be some mistake." "I was with her when she died." Hero leaned forward. "When was the last time you saw her?" Lady Sewell rose very slowly and walked across the room to stare out the window, one hand clutching into a fist around the striped silk of the curtain at her side. Instead of answering, she said, "You say you were with Rachel when she died? When did this happen?" "Last Monday, at the Magdalen house." Lady Sewell whirled to face her. "At the what?" "The Magdalen house. It was a refuge for women wishing to leave their life on the streets." "I know what it was." Hero watched as horror and disbelief flickered through those beautiful green eyes. "You can't be serious." "Where did you think she's been all this time?" said Hero. "You knew she wasn't in Northamptonshire." "I'd hoped—" Lady Sewell's voice caught. She swallowed, her throat working convulsively. "You said you were with Rachel. What were you doing at this refuge?" "I've been conducting research for a bill to be introduced to Parliament. I've discovered that women tend to enter prostitution for 2 reasons. For some, it's quite straightforward. They simply can't earn enough money to stay alive any other way. The second reason is more complicated. It's as if, for some women, life on the streets becomes a form of never-ending penance. It's as if they see themselves as ruined and give up any hope of ever leading a respectable life." Lady Sewell stood stiffly, her chest jerking with each convulsively indrawn breath. Hero pushed on. "If Rachel needed money or a refuge, surely she could have come to you, couldn't she?" When the woman remained silent, Hero said again, "Couldn't she?" Lady Sewell reached out one hand to grip the back of a nearby chair. Hating herself for what she was doing, Hero said, "Why did your sister leave home?" Lady Sewell swallowed again, then shook her head and said in a hoarse whisper, "I don't know. She was happy with her betrothal. At least, I thought she was." "Did she quarrel with your father, perhaps?" Sudden fury flared in the other woman's eyes, bringing a flush of hot colour to her pale cheeks. "What do you mean by that?" She pushed away from the chair, then drew herself up short. "If you're suggesting—" She broke off. Hero stared at the other woman in confusion.
Suggesting what? Lady Sewell brought one hand to her forehead in a distracted gesture and turned half away. Why are you here? Asking these questions? Involving yourself in this? Because your sister died in my arms. She was shot. Rachel's sister spun back around, all trace of colour leaving her face again. But the Magdalene house burned. The fire at the Magdalene house wasn't an accident. Those women were murdered, although because of what they were, no one seems to care. For one telling moment, Lady Sewell's gaze met hers, then wavered away. I'd like to be alone now. Hero rose to her feet. She discovered that her hands were tingling, and tightened her hold on the strings of her reticule. If you're interested, Rachel was buried by the Society of Friends at their meeting house in Pentonville. Please, just go. Hero inclined her head and turned toward the door. Lady Sewell still stood tall and rigid beside the windows. But when Hero glanced back at the woman's mask-like face, she saw the glistening of silent tears. Charles, Lord Jarvis, was in the courtyard of Carlton House preparing for the arrival of the Spanish minister when Colonel Bryce Epsom Smith walked up to him, the heels of his boots tapping a military-like staccato as he crossed the paving. There have been some developments, said Epsom Smith, his voice pitched low. Jarvis swung his head to study the colonel's lean, sun-darkened features. Not here. They walked away from the turmoil of the reception area into the lee of the portico. Now what? Snapped Jarvis, as the cool shadows of the coming evening closed around them. The assailant who survived last night's attack is dead. Did you learn anything from him? Unfortunately, he died before we could reach him. Epsom Smith stared off across the courtyard entrance of the palace. There's more. What else? This afternoon, one of our men, Farley, was following Miss Jarvis when she met up with Lord Devlin. Farley lost them. Jarvis was silent long enough that a muscle jumped along the colonel's jaw. Where did this happen? Near the tower. Miss Jarvis initially encountered Devlin at the surgery of an Irishman, Paul Gibson. Farley trailed them from there to the Church of St. Olaf on Seething Lane. What? What on earth were they doing there? I don't know, sir, but I suspect it was merely a stratagem. When Farley followed them into the church, Devlin backtracked and cut the cinch on Farley's saddle. Our man didn't catch up with them until some time later, at Bow Street. Bow Street? Yes, my lord. Sir William has been murdered. I'm afraid Miss Jarvis was there when the body was discovered. Is she all right? Miss Jarvis? The question seemed to surprise the colonel. Of course, my lord. Out on Pall Mall, the new gas lamps had been lit, their flares' feeble flickers just visible in the last gasps of daylight. Your man's an idiot, said Jarvis. Yes, sir. But I thought you should know that it is evidently Miss Jarvis's intent to elude our protection. Jarvis drew out his snuff-box and flipped it open with one expert flick of his finger. He didn't look at Epsom Smith, although he was aware of the man beside him. Epsom Smith was coldly efficient and utterly ruthless. He didn't usually fail. Jarvis lifted a pinch of snuff to one nostril, sniffed, and said, I don't care if you need to set a regiment to follow Miss Jarvis through the streets of London. This is not to happen again. Understood? Something flickered in the other man's eyes, then was gone. Yes, sir. And Lord Devlin? Jarvis snapped his snuff-box closed and turned back toward the colonel. I told you. I'll deal with Devlin. Chapter 37. Sebastian was crossing Margaret Street, headed toward a meeting with Sir Henry at Queen Square, when he heard himself hailed by an imperious voice. Lord Devlin! Sebastian turned. Attired in evening dress and a silk-lined cape that fluttered open with each angry step, Lord Fairchild strode purposely toward him across New Palace Yard.
"This must stop,"
the Baron blustered as he came up to Sebastian.
"Do you hear me, sir? It must stop."
"I beg your pardon." Lord Fairchild's face darkened to a hue somewhere between magenta and purple.
"Don't play me for a fool."
He spat the words out like bullets.
"You know full well of what I speak."
"If you mean my investigation into the murder of your Lord Fairchild made a low, growling sound deep in his throat.
"Not here, for God's sake,"
he snapped, drawing Sebastian farther up the pavement.
"Is that what this is all about?"
His voice dropped to an acid whisper.
"Do you seek to damage me by attacking my daughter's reputation?"
"What this is about," said Sebastian, his gaze searching the other man's mottled, distorted features, "is justice. Justice for a murdered woman lying in an unmarked grave." The Baron clenched his teeth together so tightly his jaw quivered.
"My daughter is in Northamptonshire. You hear me? Northamptonshire. If you persist in insinuating otherwise, I swear to God I'll call you out for it."
Sebastian studied the beefy, red-faced lord before him. He thought about the short, tragic life of Rachel Fairchild, and about Lord Fairchild's fondness for little girls, and he knew a revulsion so swift and profound it turned his stomach. Once, Sebastian had thought the link between father and child one of the closest bonds in nature, second only to that between a mother and her children. Sebastian's relationship with his own father had never been an easy one. He'd always known he both baffled and disappointed Hendon. There had even been a time, in the dark days after the death of the last of Sebastian's brothers, that Sebastian would have said Hendon hated him for living, when Hendon's other sons had died. Yet through it all, Hendon's devotion to the preservation of his remaining son, and the pledge he represented to the future, had endured. Sebastian had always believed it must be so for all fathers. It was only in the past year that he had come to realize just how fragile and secondary paternal devotion could sometimes be. The bells of Westminster began to chime the hour, the melodious notes echoing out over the city. "I understand there's an important debate this evening on the orders in council," said Sebastian evenly. "You're missing it." Lord Fairchild opened his mouth and closed it, then swung away, his jaw held tight, his head thrust forward like a bull's. Sebastian waited until the Baron had taken several strides before calling after him, "I hear you're the one who discovered your wife's body. How tragic." The Baron swung back around, his massive frame quivering with fury.
"If you mean to insinuate—"
"I insinuate nothing," said Sebastian, and continued on his way to Queen Square.
"It's quite an innovation,"
said Sir Henry Lovejoy, nodding to the rows of flickering gas lamps that bathed the interior of MacLeod's coffee shop in a soft golden glow. Gas lamps had already replaced the oil lamps along Pall Mall and in the surrounding streets, but few shop owners were as innovative or as courageous as the proprietors of MacLeod's. The sputtering gas jets and occasional explosions and asphyxiations generally limited the introduction of gas to the outdoors.
"I've heard it said that some day not only every street in London, but every house in London will be lit by the gasworks."
Sebastian shifted his weight against the booth's unpadded back.
"I've heard it said that the runoff from the gasworks is what's killing the fish in the Thames."
Sir Henry brushed away the suggestion of pollution with an impatient hand. Apart from the law, the only other passion in the little magistrate's life was science, and he brooked no criticism of it.
"There are always naysayers."
Sebastian simply smiled and raised his coffee to his lips. Sir Henry cleared his throat.
"I understand it was your misfortune to discover Sir William this afternoon. It's why you've sought me out, isn't it, and bought me this coffee?"
Sebastian laughed.
"I'd have bought you a brandy, but I know you don't imbibe."
A fervently devout man, Sir Henry had secret leanings toward the Reformist Church, although he generally kept his views to himself. being anything other than high church wasn't good for one's career. He said, "I take it you think this death is somehow linked to what happened at the Magdalen House on Monday." The barest hint of a smile tugged the edges of the Queen Square magistrate's mouth. "I know you have continued to involve yourself in the investigation." Sebastian took another sip of coffee. "It was my understanding there was no investigation." "Not officially, but according to Sir William's clerk, Sir William was intrigued by what had happened." Sebastian knew a flicker of surprise, although when he thought about it, he realized it made sense. By instructing Sir William to shut down any speculation about the fire, Lord Jarvis had obviously sparked the magistrate's curiosity. "Officially," Lovejoy was saying, "the fire was just a fire. But Sir William was nevertheless pursuing a few discreet inquiries." "Obviously not discreet enough." "You think it's why he was killed?" "Yes." Sir Henry cleared his throat again. "It's rather embarrassing, you know, having the Chief Magistrate of Bow Street murdered in his own public office." "Is that why it's been released that Sir William died of an apoplectic fit?" "There will be rumours, of course. But then there would have been rumours even if he had died of an apoplectic fit." "Very true." Lovejoy fixed him with an uncompromising stare. "Tell me about the Magdalen House fire." Sebastian gave the magistrate a carefully edited version of what he had so far discovered. He left out all mention of Russian sables and Irish thieves, but the tale he wove was still sordid and utterly inconclusive. In the end, the magistrate removed his wire-framed glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "It's all rather complicated. It's as if it goes off in 6 different directions at once." Sebastian said, "I'm obviously missing something. Something important." Sir Henry fit his glasses back on his face and cleared his throat again. "I've been offered the position of Bow Street magistrate." Sebastian raised one eyebrow. "Congratulations." "It is an honour, of course. I wouldn't be chief magistrate. Sir James will replace Sir William in that capacity. But, well, if truth were told, I suspect I might somewhat miss Queen Square." "So you haven't decided yet whether or not to accept?" "No. The prestige means nothing to me, but—" The magistrate hesitated, and Sebastian knew he was remembering certain incidents in the past when Bow Street had interfered in Sir Henry's own investigations in a high-handed and contemptuous manner. "It is tempting," said Sebastian. "Yes." The door to the coffee shop swung inward to admit another customer, who brought with him the smell of coming rain and a great gust of wind that snuffed out 3 of the gas lamps on the nearest wall. "The fault is in the design of the gas jets," said Sir Henry, as the proprietor bustled forward with a taper to relight them. "With a better design, that wouldn't have happened." When Sebastian remained silent, he added, "Imagine the reduction in crime the city will experience once every street is illuminated by gas." "As long as there's no wind," said Sebastian. "I tell you the fault's in the design of the jets," insisted Sir Henry. But Sebastian only laughed. Chapter 38. That evening, shortly before dinner, Hero was working in the library when her father entered the room. Lord Jarvis rarely dined at his own home. Looking up, she had little doubt as to why he was here now. He stared at the books she had scattered across the library table and frowned. "What is all this?" Hero laid down her pen and sat back. "Some research I'm doing." Lord Jarvis grunted. "Why can't you arrange flowers and embroider seat covers like other women?" "Because I'm your daughter," she said, gathering the books into a neat stack. He didn't even smile. Pressing both hands flat on the tabletop, he leaned into them, his gaze hard on her face. "What exactly is Devlin's interest in the deaths of the Magdalen House women?" Hero stared up at him without flinching. His lackey had obviously wasted no time reporting back to him. "The same as mine, to see justice done." Pushing away from the table, he swiped one big hand through the air, like someone brushing aside an annoying gnat.
There is no justice in this world. There are only the strong and the weak. Those women were weak.
Which is why it is the obligation of the strong to fight for them. Lord Jarvis let out his breath in a scornful huff.
I told you I would deal with those responsible.
Hero pushed to her feet. Because of me, not because of them.
What difference does that make?
She found herself oddly reluctant to explain to him the effect her meeting with Rachel Fairchild had had upon her, or the guilt that drove her to try to understand what had gone wrong in the young woman's life. She said instead, "Has your Colonel Epsom Smith discovered those responsible?"
Not yet, but he will.
He turned away to pour himself a glass of brandy.
You broke our agreement. You went to Bow Street.
On a slightly different errand. You heard Sir William is dead.
Yes.
Did you know he was involved with one of the women killed? Jarvis looked over at her.
Who told you that? Devlin?
No, someone else. Jarvis grunted.
You brought Devlin into this?
Yes.
How much does he know?
He asked, decanter in hand. You mean, does he know I was at the Magdalen house when it was attacked? Yes. Lord Jarvis poured himself a measure of brandy, then replaced the stopper in the decanter and set it aside without looking at her. She knew he was choosing his words carefully.
Devlin wouldn't hesitate to hurt you to get at me. You know that, don't you?
She chose her words with equal care. I know he is your enemy, but I do not believe he would hurt me to get at you. He's not, she started to say, like you, then changed it to, like that. She expected him to laugh at her again. Instead, he merely looked thoughtful. He took a slow sip of his drink, his gaze turned now to study her face in a way that made her uncomfortable. He said,
Why Devlin?
Because he's the one man in this country who isn't afraid of you, she thought. But again, she didn't say it. She said, he has achieved good results in the past, in similar situations.
And did you ask yourself why he agreed to help?
I know why he agreed. To get back at you.
Yet you say he wouldn't hurt you.
That's right. He went to sit in one of the upholstered chairs near the empty hearth, his glass cradled in his palm.
I set Farley to follow you this afternoon for your own protection. You knew that, yet you evaded him. Why?
I know something of your Colonel's methods. The last thing I would ever want to do is unwittingly furnish him with a few more hapless victims. Lord Jarvis pressed his lips together in a frown.
That's not the intent here.
She met his gaze squarely. It's not a risk I'm willing to take. He glared right back at her.
And your exposing yourself to danger is a risk I'm not willing to take.
Papa. She went to lean over the back of his chair, her arms looped around his neck. I was never in any danger this afternoon, and you know it. He brought up one of his big hands to cover hers. With anyone else he would have been overbearing and coldly threatening, but he'd learned long ago that didn't work with Hero. She was too much like him. He said,
Where did you go this afternoon?
To meet a woman I hoped would help me make some sense of what happened at the Magdalen house. He took a long swallow of his brandy.
With Devlin?
Yes.
I suppose it's better than going on your own.
He shifted his hand to lightly grasp her wrist and tug her around so that he could see her face.
Finding out about this woman is so important to you?
Yes. He shook his head.
I don't understand it.
I know. He hesitated, and she knew again the fear that he would forbid her to continue her inquiries. But all he said was,
I would ask you to be careful.
I will, I promise. He nodded.
You are unusually sensible for a woman, however ill-advised your political ideas are.
She knew he had said it to provoke her, but she only smiled, and refused to rise to the bait. That night, Hero and her mother were descending the steps of their Berkeley Square house toward the carriage that had been ordered to take them to a fashionable soirée, when a malodorous little boy came pelting down the footpath toward them. "My goodness," gasped Lady Jarvis, shrinking back in a cloud of pale azure satin, as the boy slammed right into Hero.
"You there!" shouted the butler, starting forward. "Watch where you're going!"
But the boy was already off, feet flying, one hand held up to clamp his cap to his head as he disappeared around the corner.
"Brazen gutter snipes,"
muttered Grisham, staring after him.
"Whatever is the world coming to? I trust you suffered no harm, Miss Jarvis."
"I'm fine," said Hero. The folded missive slipped her by the boy, carefully tucked out of sight. Chapter 39. Friday, 8th of May, 1812. The next day, Hero, dressed in her plainest riding gown, topped by a particularly ugly hat with a dense veil that made her grandmother and prophesy she was destined to end her days as an old maid. "I sincerely hope so," said Hero, then prudently whisked herself out of the room to avoid being sucked into an old and well-worn argument. She evaded the watchdog set by her father simply by descending into the kitchens to confer with the housekeeper, and then slipping out by the area steps. Walking briskly to the corner of Davis Street, she caught a hackney and directed the driver to number 41, Brook Street. It was most unseemly for a young unmarried woman to visit the house of an unmarried gentleman, particularly without her maid. Hero had given the situation considerable thought, but in the end decided there was no avoiding it. She had promised her father she would not put herself in danger, and Hero Jarvis kept her promises. Her major concern was that she might find Lord Devlin already gone from home. Paying off the hackney, she rang an imperious peal on the Viscount's door. It was opened almost at once by a military-looking major-domo who regarded her with unconcealed suspicion. "Pray inform Lord Devlin that I am here to see him," she said loftily.
"And whom shall I say is calling?"
"My good man," said Hero, at her most condescending, "if I wanted you to know my name, I would have given it to you." The major-domo hesitated. Fear of giving offence to a veiled noblewoman warred with the horror of ushering some grasping harpy into his master's presence. Fear of giving offence won. He bowed and let her in.
"One moment, while I see if his lordship is receiving."
He achieved a measure of revenge by leaving her in the hall, rather than ushering her into a receiving room. He returned in a moment, his face giving nothing away, to lead her upstairs to the drawing-room.
"Tea will arrive shortly,"
drawled the major-domo, and withdrew. Pushing back her veil, Hero prowled the room. She studied the curious, intricately incised brass platter on one wall, the carved wooden head that looked as if it had come from Africa on another. A tea-tray arrived, along with a plate of bread and butter, but she ignored it, her attention caught by a painting over the mantel. It was by Gainsborough, of a laughing young woman with unpowdered golden hair and a braid-trimmed riding costume in the style of the last century. Hero could trace the resemblance to the Viscount in the flare of the woman's cheekbones, the curve of the lips. So this was Devlin's mother, Hero thought. They still talked about the long-dead Countess of Hendon in scandalized whispers. She was so absorbed in her study of the painting that she failed to hear the door open behind her.
"I suspected it was you," said an amused voice, "from my major-domo's description. I don't know that many tall, haughty gentlewomen with the manner of a Turkish pasha."
She swung to face him. "I don't know any Turkish pashas."
"Which is probably a good thing," he said, leaving the door open behind him. "They like their women obsequious and agreeable."
"Like most Englishmen."
"Like most men," he agreed, advancing into the room.
He was dressed in doeskin breeches and a well-tailored dark coat, but his hair still curled damply away from his face. She said, "I've caught you at your bath."
"Actually, you caught me still abed."
He glanced at the tea, which she hadn't touched.
"Join me?" he asked, pouring a cup.
She took it from his outstretched hand. "You haven't asked me why I'm here." He poured himself a cup and lifted one of the pieces of buttered bread from the plate.
"I have no doubt it is your intention to enlighten me."
He had a nearly limitless capacity for irritating her, and it did no good to remind herself that he provoked her intentionally. The urge to simply set down her tea and leave was overcome with difficulty. A promise was a promise. She said, "I've received a note from Tasman Pool. A boy passed it to me as I was about to enter my carriage last night." He selected another slice of buttered bread.
"She has located the missing Hannah Green."
"So it seems. The woman is hiding in a cottage just off Strand Lane, and she has agreed to meet me there." The Viscount swallowed his bread and took a sip of tea.
"You're suspicious. Why?"
"I am to go there at midday with only one servant to accompany me. According to the note, these precautions are necessary because Hannah Green is frightened. I believe the note to be genuine, but I am aware of the possibility that it could be a trap."
"It certainly sounds like one to me."
"Yet if it's not, and I fail to go, the chance to meet Hannah Green will be lost." He reached for another slice of bread.
"Are you certain you don't want some of this?" he asked, nudging the plate toward her. "It's really quite good."
"Thank you, but I breakfasted hours ago."
"Is that an insult? I wonder."
"Yes." He laughed and finished the last of the bread.
"I think I begin to understand. If you were anyone else, I might assume you had come to ask for my advice. On the strength of our limited acquaintance, however, I suspect you've already made up your mind to go and have simply come here to request that I accompany you."
His gaze took in her riding costume.
"Posing, I take it, as your groom?"
"And to beg the loan of a horse. I was forced to slip out the basement to avoid my watchdog."
"We could take a hackney."
"Then I would need a lady's maid, not a groom," she pointed out.
"True. Unfortunately, I don't own any ladies' horses."
"Neither do I." She glanced at the ormolu clock on the mantel. "If you have finished your tea and bread."
"It's a trap, you know," he said, suddenly serious.
"Will you do it?"
"Drink your tea," he told her, "while I transfer myself into a more humble attire."
Lying just to the west of St. Clement's, Strand Lane proved to be a narrow cobbled passage that wound a tortuous path down toward the river. The day was overcast and cold, with a kind of biting wind more typical of March than May. Pausing his gelding at the head of the lane, Sebastian let his gaze flick to the watch-house and church of St. Mary's that had been left marooned in the centre of the Strand by the widening of the street.
"It seems an unlikely place for a frightened prostitute to go to ground," he said.
"Perhaps she grew up around here," said Miss Jarvis, reining in her mount beside him. He kneed his horse forward between aged gabled houses of timber and whitewashed daub that nearly met overhead. The buildings might be old, but they were well kept, the cobbles and worn doorsteps swept clean. A little girl dashed past, laughing as she chased a kitten through flowers tumbling out of green-painted window boxes. They passed a ramshackle old inn, the Cock and Magpie, and a livery. But within 100 yards or so, the lane unexpectedly opened up to their right, and Sebastian found himself staring out over a tumble-down stone wall at a stretch of open land.
"It's a curious place for a meeting," he said, reining in.
He could see, scattered amidst rioting wisteria and lilacs, the broken, ivy-covered statues and rusted iron gates of an abandoned garden that stretched all the way to the terrace and neoclassical side elevation of Somerset House in the distance. "It's the ruins of the eastern gardens of the original Somerset House," said Miss Jarvis. "When they tore down the old palace, the plan was to construct an eastern wing on the new building that would stretch nearly to Surrey Street.
But the government ran out of money. My father is always raging about it. He thinks the capital of a great nation needs impressive government buildings, and London is woefully lacking in anything majestic or monumental. Sebastian narrowed his eyes against the glint of the light reflected off the Thames. Down near the river's edge, to their left, stood a lumber yard, its great stacks of drying timber towering 20 to 30 feet in the air. But a strange air of quiet hung over the area. "I don't like it," he said, thankful for the weight of the small double-barreled flintlock pistol he slipped into the pocket of his groom's coat before leaving Brook Street. "Surely, if it were a trap," she said, "the rendezvous would have been set for tonight. What are they going to do? Cosh me and my servant over the head in broad daylight? It's not exactly a disreputable neighbourhood."
"Would you have come here at night?"
"Of course not." Sebastian studied the expanse of overgrown gravel paths and untamed shrubbery.
"Where exactly is this Hannah Green supposed to be?"
"There," said Miss Jarvis, nodding to what looked like a caretaker's cottage at the base of the garden near the water's edge. Sebastian swung out of the saddle.
"Wait here," he told her. "Your groom is going to knock on the door."
He expected her to argue. Instead, she took his reins in her strong gloved hand, a frown line forming between her eyes as she studied the small stone house. The original Somerset House had been built in the mid-16th century by the Duke of Somerset, uncle and Lord Protector of the boy king Edward VI, a vast Renaissance palace that had been pulled down late in the previous century and replaced by the current Somerset House, now used by various royal societies and government offices. Only this stretch of the old gardens had survived. Once the sandstone cottage near the river might have been a part of the ancient Tudor palace itself, a retainer's lodge perhaps, or a delightful garden retreat for the dowager queens who had once used the old palace as their dower house. The echoes of the original house's Renaissance glory were there, in the crumbling stone steps, in the sweet-scented damask rose blooming stubbornly from amidst a thicket of thistles. Sebastian walked up the neglected path, the gravel crunching beneath his feet, his senses alert to any movement, any sound. The garden appeared deserted. Studying the cobwebs draping the delicately carved tracery of the windows and the leaded panes, Sebastian knocked on the warped old door and listened to the sound fade away into nothing. He was raising his fist to knock again when he heard a furtive whisper of sound from the far side of the thick panels. The scrape of a slipper over stone flagging, perhaps, or the brush of cloth against cloth. He waited, aware of a sense of being watched. Tilting back his head, he scanned the crenellated decoration at the wall's edge, then heard the rasp of a bolt being drawn back. The door creaked inward a foot and stopped. He had a glimpse of a young woman's pale face, her brown eyes widening in fear. Behind her stretched an empty stone-flagged passageway with thick whitewashed walls.
"Miss Jarvis sent me to inquire,"
he began, only to have the woman let out a little mewl of terror. Her hands slipping off the door's latch, she whirled, her fists clenching in her skirts, her brown hair flying as she pelted back down the passageway. Thrusting open the door with one outflung hand, Sebastian sprinted after her. He took 2 steps, 3, then felt a blinding pain that crashed down upon the back of his head and brought with it the bright darkness of oblivion. Chapter 40. The pain was still there. He realized he was lying on something cold and hard. That confused him. He considered opening his eyes to investigate, but at the moment that seemed more effort than it was worth. He lay still, trying to recall where he was and what he was doing here. He remembered handing the reins of his horse to Hero Jarvis. He remembered walking through the abandoned garden. Stone steps, a warped door, a brown-eyed woman running.
He shifted his weight, wincing as a jagged agony arced around the side of his head. From somewhere quite close, he heard Miss Jarvis say, "You were right. It was a trap." He opened his eyes. He found himself staring at a stone-groined vault high above where he lay. The stones were old and worn and stained with damp. Turning his head ever so carefully, he was able to see a row of thick, crude pillars holding up the roof, and the no-nonsense face of Miss Jarvis. He groaned again and closed his eyes. Where the hell are we? I'm not entirely certain what this place was originally. At first I thought it might be the crypt of one of the churches or chapels Somerset pulled down to build his palace, but more likely it's simply a storeroom or cellar from one of the medieval bishop's palaces he also tore down. Sebastian brought up a hand to probe gingerly at the back of his head. And why precisely are we here? I'm told the vault floods when the tide comes in. He opened his eyes again, his hand falling. He realized he was lying on a wide elevated stone ledge some 3 feet off the ground that ran along as much of the crypt wall as he could see. She sat perched on the edge of the ledge beside him. She was hunched forward, her arms crossed at her waist, her hands hugging her elbows in close. From the way she had her jaw set, he suspected that she was having to try very, very hard to keep control of herself. He realized her veiled hat was gone, her sleeve torn. However she had come to be here with him, she obviously had not come without a fight. "What happened?" he asked. She rocked gently back and forth in a movement so subtle he doubted that she even knew she was doing it. "I waited for you for about 5 minutes, but you never came back. Just as I was trying to decide what to do, a gentleman walked out of the Cock and Magpie and asked if I needed help." "A gentleman?" "Most definitely a gentleman. He was both well-dressed and well-spoken, just like the gentleman with the gig on the road from Richmond." "And?" he prompted. "I wheeled my horse, meaning to flee, but he reached up and grabbed my reins just above the bit, and then he pulled a pistol on me." "In a respectable neighborhood, in broad daylight?" "Quite," she said evenly. "I freely admit to deserving any and all reproaches you care to heap upon my head. It was a trap." He might not like Hero Jarvis, but there was much that he found he did, reluctantly, admire about her, and so he surprised himself by saying gently, "We all make mistakes." She raised her head to look at him. "When they dragged me down here—" "They?" "Yes. Another man joined us in the garden. They had simply dumped you at the foot of the steps. I thought you were dead." "What steps?" he said, trying to sit up. She turned to help him. "Do you think that's wise?" "What time does the tide come in? Any idea?" "It's been running at about 5:30, I think." "And what time is it now?" "You can hear the bells of St. Clement's down here. They just tolled 3. Sebastian had aborted his attempt to stand and contented himself with sitting, slumped, while he regained his breath. He said, "If I was on the floor, how did I end up on the ledge?" "I requested they pick you up and put you on the ledge. They ridiculed me for it, but in the end they did it." He could imagine her high-handed orders to her captors, the men's laughing compliance. She said, "They also left the lantern at my request. I told them I was afraid of rats." His gaze fell to the simple tin lantern with horn windows at their feet, its single tallow candle spilling a faint golden glow that left the farthest reaches of the chamber in darkness. "Are there rats?" "I haven't seen any." The giddiness was beginning to recede. He said, "Tell me about the steps." "They're there, just to our right. They're barred by an iron gate at the base and a stout wooden door at the top." He could see them now, worn, shadowy steps disappearing upward. He lurched to his feet and reached for the lantern. She got to it first. "If you insist on inspecting the gate, I'll carry the lantern. If you drop it, I've no way to rekindle the candle, and neither do you." "How do you know I've no tinderbox?" "I checked your pockets." He clapped a hand to the capacious pocket of his groom's coat. His pistol was gone. With difficulty he overcame the impulse to swear long and crudely. The gate covered an arched opening some 4 feet wide. Built of iron, with thick vertical bars braced top and bottom by stout crosspieces, it looked newly installed, without a trace of rust. A thick chain had been wrapped around the bars twice, then secured by a heavy padlock, well beyond his reach. He clasped both hands around one of the iron bars and pushed. Its solidity mocked him. She said, "I did check it. It's quite strong." He tested each bar and crosspiece himself, just to be certain, but he doubted even the strength of 10 men could dislodge them. Breathing heavily again, he leaned against the gate, his gaze on the stairwell it protected. From here he could see that the steps led up to a stout wooden door set into a corbelled arch at the top. He said, "There was a woman in the house, a young woman. Did you see her?" Miss Jarvis shook her head. "They never took me into the house. These steps lead down from an alcove in the garden wall near the river." He could see a point, some 10 or 12 steps up, where the stonework used for the steps changed, became darker, less worn, as if it were of a more recent construction. He'd heard tales of the building of the old Somerset house by Edward Seymour, about how he'd appropriated land occupied by the inns of the bishops of Chester and Lichfield, Coventry and Worcester. The old bishops' palaces had been pulled down, their building materials either reused or dumped as fill to raise the height of the garden for a terrace. "Let me see the lantern," he said, reaching for it. "Are you quite certain you're—" "I'm fine." Holding the lantern aloft, he explored the crypt. Built of worked sandstone blocks, it was a space some 45 to 50 feet long and 5 bays wide, the ceiling vault supported on rows of squat plain pillars. One end was neatly walled off with a darker sandstone that reminded him of the upper steps. At the other end, the far reaches of the chamber disappeared beneath a cascade of rubble. He played the lantern light over the jumble of stones, some rough, others shaped but broken. Here and there he saw glimpses of carvings, of scrollwork, and carefully incised patterns. "That's where the river is," she said, coming to stand beside him. "How far?" "Some 10 or 12 feet, I'd say." "So much for any wild schemes of digging through the rubble to freedom." "I've seen engravings of the Thames from the days when the bishops' palaces stretched from the river to the Strand," she said. "Some of them were constructed over arches that opened to the river. Barges used to come up the river and then pull in under the arches to unload. It could be that's what this is from." "So maybe it won't flood completely," he said, his head falling back as he studied the worn stone of the ceiling vaults. "I suspect they tested the theory before they left us down here to die," she said dryly. He glanced over at her. She'd kept pace with him as he prowled the crypt, her hands still clutching her elbows in close to her sides. He said, "Why leave us down here? Why not simply kill us outright?" She squared her shoulders. "As I understand it, their intention is to throw our bodies in the river, make it look as if we'd suffered an accident. Any autopsy would simply show that we'd drowned, wouldn't it?" "Why would they care whether or not it was obvious we were murdered?" "That I don't know." He met her gaze. Her eyes were dilated so wide they looked black. "I don't intend to drown," he said, turning back toward the steps. She trailed after him, or more exactly, after the light. "Well, that's reassuring." He laughed softly, the lantern making a chink as he set it down on the stone paving. "We could try shouting." "I did. Do you have any idea how much earth there is on the top of us?" He was trying not to think about that. "Where are you going?" she asked, as he headed back toward the rubble wall. He selected a massive chunk of what looked like a broken Ionic capital from some long-ago despoiled church. Bending his knees and grunting, he hoisted it to his chest, his head swimming sickeningly. She watched, silent, as he staggered back toward the gate and heaved it at the padlocked chain. It clattered against the iron, then crashed to the stone floor. The chained gate held firm. Swearing, he heaved the stone at the gate again and again until he was sweating, and his hands were bleeding from the stone's jagged edges. After perhaps the 10th try, she said calmly, "Stop it. It isn't doing any good, and you're only hurting yourself." He swung to face her, his breath shuddering his chest. "Do you have a better idea?" "We could try to set fire to the door. Someone might see the smoke and come to investigate." It was a crazy idea, but not without merit. He eyed the distance to the door at the top of the stairs. "And how do you propose we do that?" "I don't know." Still breathing hard, he went back to select a fist-sized chunk of rock from the rubble. "Here, hold this," he said, handing her the rock. He stripped off his groom's coat and waistcoat, then pulled his shirt off over his head. The damp chill of the subterranean vault sent a shiver through him. He hadn't thought to check his boot to see if they'd missed his knife. They had. "Do you always carry that?" she asked, watching him slip the knife from its hidden sheath. "Always." He flashed her a smile that showed his teeth. "I even threw it at your father once." Using the blade, he sliced his shirt into strips and began to plait them. Her mind was quick. She said, "Let me help." He wrapped the plaited shirt around the rock like a long wick, then opened the hinged tin and horn door of the lantern. "Don't put out the candle," she warned. Grunting, he kindled the torn edge of the shirt, watched it flare and catch. Thrusting his arms through the iron bars of the gate, he held the burning, weighted shirt as long as he could, then he hurled it at the door above. It flew through the air, a flaming catapult that illuminated the shadowy stairwell, and hit the stout door with a solid thud. Falling to the stone lintel in a shower of sparks, it burned up bright for one shining moment, and went out. "Hell and the devil confound it," he whispered, then added, "I beg your pardon, Miss Jarvis." She stood beside him, her hands like his gripping the bars of the gate. "That's quite all right." He swung to look at her, assessing the sturdy cloth of her riding habit. It wouldn't burn any better than his coat or waistcoat. She said, "Why are you looking at me like that?" "Your petticoats." "My—" She broke off. He thought for a moment that she meant to refuse him, but what she said was, "Turn around." He went to select more rocks from the rubble. She said, "I'm finished." He threw his coat up to the door first, followed by his rough waistcoat, not even bothering to try to light them first. "Why?" she asked, as he set to work ripping the first of her fine petticoats. "They're fodder. The lawn of the petticoats will burn fast, but the wool coat will smoulder." "We hope." "We hope," he agreed. He threw the first petticoat-wrapped rock short, so that it burned in a bright, useless heap on the second step. The second try landed square. "Thank goodness," she whispered, pressing against the gate, her gaze on the small fire above. It burned for a time, long enough to fill the air with smoke and the pungent odour of singed wool. Coughing, she said, "Will it kill us, do you think? The smoke, I mean." "Probably not, if we go to the far end of the chamber, near the rubble. I could feel air coming in there." But in the end, they had no need to retreat. Once again the fire sputtered and went out. They had part of one petticoat left. "It isn't going to work," he said. "It has to work." She pushed away from the gate. "Start ripping up the last petticoat," she said, getting to work on the brass buttons of her riding habit. "Your coat was wet from lying on the stone." "You'll be cold," he said. She stripped off her habit with angry, purposeful jerks, the white flesh of her arms bathed in gold by the dim light of the flickering lantern. "Just hit the door." Both parts of the riding habit landed with satisfying plops atop his coat and waistcoat. He'd have added his breeches too, but they were of buckskin and would never burn. Clad only in her short, lightweight stays, a thin chemise, boots and stockings, she watched him carefully kindle the last petticoat. He let it flare up until it was almost burning his hand, then lobbed it at the pile of clothes above. This time the cloth beneath the burning missile caught, blazing up hot and fast. The air filled with the crackle of flames, the smell of singed wood. They stood and watched it burn, the big bell of St. Clement's tolling 4 times in the distance. Then, as the small bell began to toll again for those who might have miscounted the first bell, this fire, too, hissed softly and went out.